protocol development effort. I think we'll pause for a moment just to let any other people join us. There's quite a good number of people registered. For now, if you have the ability to speak, if you could all mute yourselves on your end, then that'd be great. And I'll pause and we'll come back in just a moment. Thanks, everyone. All right, hello folks. I think it's probably a good time for us to get started. Just a very quick intro and then we'll do proper introductions in a minute. Sammy Osmond here at the Climate Action Reserve. And this is our first work group meeting for our soil enrichment protocol development effort. So welcome to you all. Looks like we've got about maybe 70% of people who are registered already on. So I think we'll probably get moving and we can expect people to join us over the next few minutes, hopefully. So, let's see. Okay, I'll give a quick introduction to the purpose and then we'll turn it over to Craig Ebert, who's the president of the Climate Action Reserve, who's going to give us a little bit more of an introduction. So the purpose today is to familiarise the workgroup members with the offset protocol development purpose and what we typically like to see in an offset protocol. And also we have some specific ideas that we'd like to present to the workgroup in particular, but also the observers, and to solicit your feedback on some of those key considerations. And just at the outset, in the interest of transparency, the Reserve would like to note that Indigo Ag has provided financial support for the development of this protocol. And I might turn it over now to Craig to say a few words.
Thank you, Sammy. This is Craig Ebert. I'm president of the Climate Action Reserve. And on behalf of the Reserve, I wanted to thank each and every one of you for joining this critical effort. I don't think I need to tell any of you just how critical the climate crisis is. And we're here today to kick off what I think is a very important opportunity to address that climate crisis. I think as many as you know, there have been various attempts in the past to come up with a soil enrichment protocol. And for a variety of reasons, often over issues around establishing a baseline and measuring the flux off that baseline, it's been difficult to do. We are certainly hoping over the next several months that we can crack that nut and bring to market what is a fundamentally critical solution to addressing climate change. The emission scenarios we're looking at globally all point to significant warming above and beyond a safe threshold. One critical solution that we all have in our midst is the ability to actually extract carbon from the atmosphere through soil enrichment and other natural working land solutions. So I think our ultimate charge here is to bring to market here a protocol using a standardized baseline approach, and Sammy will get into that in more detail. But our goal with adopting a standardized baseline format is to make sure that we have as widespread of a potential application for the protocol as possible. And I think the charge to each and every one of you is that we need a protocol that addresses all of your key questions. and I'm sure you won't be shy about bringing them to the table. But I, again, just wanted to thank all of you for participating. This is, like all of our processes, is a very public, transparent process. And our goal in doing so is to making sure that everyone has who has a stake in this game, an opportunity to raise critical questions and to make sure that we have a high quality outcome at the end of the day. So again, thanks for joining. And Sammy, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Greg. All right, folks, that was a very quick introduction. We'll get a little bit more introduction in a moment, but just some housekeeping first off. So workgroup members, you will all have the opportunity to actively speak throughout the meeting, including to speak up whenever you see fit, whenever you'd like to verbally interject with any ideas or questions. So in the interests of keeping it as smooth as possible, if you could all mute yourselves until and unless you'd like to speak, that's probably going to be best, just to make sure the audio is clear. It looked like we also had somebody share their screen before, so that was nice. Hello to whoever that was. But if we could perhaps avoid screen sharing, that might also be useful. And then we'll ask and take questions throughout the session. So you'll note on various slides we've got some text highlighted in red. That's where we've sort of framed specific questions for you all. But certainly at any stage, if you'd like to ask a question, feel free to do so. Workgroup members will have the chance to use to unmute themselves and verbally ask a question. Or you're all welcome to also use the question function, which is on the little user interface, which is usually in the top right-hand side of your screen. You can hit the question function and type your questions in there. If you do that, we'll have those captured in writing, and we'll be able to either try to address them during the session or at the end of the session, or we'll be able to come back afterwards and engage with you via email or other means as well. So that's always a useful way to capture questions for posterity. All other attendees and observers are in listen-only mode, but as I mentioned, you will be able to use the question function if you'd like to pose ideas or even just general feedback to us. Very much welcome. And then we'll follow up via email, as I mentioned, with any questions that we're not able to address today. And then the obligatory question that we always get, are the slides and recordings of the presentation going to be made available? Yes to both of those. I have it on my plate to put online the slides from the first the public scoping webinar that we did. So that's coming soon too. So apologies for the delay there, but certainly a recording of this webinar and also a copy of these slides will be posted online. And I believe we also have a copy of the slide deck available to you all through the user interface as well. Let's see. Okay, so here's the agenda that we'd like to follow today. In a moment, we'll take you through some basic introductions. From there, we're going to give a little bit of an overview of the process itself. And then from there, we're going to get into the weeds a little bit. We're going to start to talk about the core components that we typically have in an offset protocol developed by the reserve. And these are the core elements that are listed here. This is the order these typically follow in a protocol itself, sometimes with some slight differences. And this is the order we'll follow today, just for simplicity's sake. There's going to be quite a number of slides here. So what I'll plan to do is actually probably not speak to every single slide. So there'll be a lot of content where we would encourage you to go and read it in your own time if you're particularly interested in that area. Otherwise, we'll try to hit on some of the main themes, and wherever we have some strong or ideas that are already formed as to how we think it would be best to approach it, then we'll concentrate on articulating those to you. It might be that we don't also cover additional slides during the webinar itself, just because of the sheer volume of information that we put to you. And then, as we mentioned, feel free to jump in at any point if you have observations or questions. Otherwise, hopefully we'll still have time at the end to do a little pause and see if we can go back through and answer questions. We've just got a question at this point. Let me pause for 1 sec. Yeah, okay. Lots of questions coming in already. That's fantastic. One other point for workgroup members, actually, I forgot to mention, if you can just use the question function, that'd be great. And then for reserve staff, if anybody needs to use me, they can use the chat function. So that might just be an easier way for us to delineate between messages that I should pause the presentation for and make sure I'm reading it, and any other questions which the rest of the reserve team can sort of help me manage, which we can come back to a little bit later. I think we might still have one or two people who haven't self-muted, so if you could make sure you go in and everybody who's not actively wanting to speak, if you can mute yourself, that would be fantastic, just to make sure we don't get any audio interference. After the discussion, we'll also follow up with some next steps. So critically, we'll be telling you about the next core steps in this process. So when are we looking to meet again? What are we going to do with materials? And what sort of time frame do we have for feedback and that sort of thing? Just pause for 1 minute. Yep, so we had a question regarding whether questions are going to show up for everybody. I'll let my colleagues handle that, but there should be the functionality that when we respond, when reserve staff responds to questions, everybody should see them. But yeah, we'll get to that in a moment. All right, let's keep moving. First, we'll start off with some general introductions. So my name is Sammy Osman. I'm a Senior Policy Manager at Climate Action Reserve. So I'll be steering the ship to some degree here. So you'll get my contact details later. Most of you already have those. Feel free to reach out to me anytime with respect to any issues raised in relation to this effort. Today for the webinar, we've also got Heather Raven, our Senior Project Coordinator. She'll be running the ship in terms of the webinar, make sure I don't break anything, and she'll be intimately involved in development of the protocol as well. We do have a broader reserve team. Obviously, it's not just the two of us, and at some point we will introduce those staff to you. In terms of the work group, in a moment, I'm going to go through a list of the workgroup members. We'll not ask people to introduce yourselves, simply because we've got such a large group of very well qualified folks that we're ecstatic to have involved here. If we pause for introductions, we'd probably extend it by another half hour to an hour. So we thought we might just list the names and organisations, and then we can sort of keep it fairly brief. And then in terms of, yeah, as I mentioned, anybody who'd like to speak, it would probably be best if you can briefly introduce yourself in terms of name and organisation, perhaps each time anybody wants to speak, just so we know anybody who's following along will be able to tell exactly who's making the comment. That would be quite helpful. So I'll give a brief introduction of the Climate Action Reserve at this point. We've done that in the public scoping webinar, but for those of you who are not familiar with the reserve, I'll give you a quick overview. So essentially the reserve's mission is to develop, promote and support innovative, credible, market-based climate change solutions that benefit economies, ecosystems and society. That's our mission statement. So what do? We develop high quality, stakeholder driven, standardized carbon offset project protocols focused on North America. That's our core expertise. So we're also an accredited offset project registry under the California Cap and Trade program. So that's California's compliance offset program. So we serve both compliant and also voluntary carbon markets. We have a reputation for integrity and its experience in providing best-in-class registry services for offset markets. And we're based in Los Angeles in California, although I have to admit I'm in Northern California, so if you're heading to LA, you might not see me. Here's an example of where our registry is most active. So you can see we've got over 550 projects at the moment. We've issued over 140 million credits. We've got a range of different protocols that are active: livestock, grassland conservation, rice cultivation, not so many rice cultivation projects, and nitrogen management. Not too many of those either, but you can see we've got mostly focused in the US. We've just launched a new grassland protocol in Canada. And we've also got a significant pipeline of forest projects in Mexico, as well as a couple of other a landfill project, and also livestock operations, which will hopefully be up and running. Predominantly focused on the US though, in terms of our existing project pipeline. Okay, now I will introduce the work group members, and as I mentioned, we'll just go through the names and organisations, and we won't ask folks to introduce themselves, but we're certainly very grateful to have each of you. We had a very strong level of support from the public here, and it was actually very difficult to whittle it down to this very broad experienced group here. So thank you very much to each of you. So we've got Adam Chambers for USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS. We've got Ami Gunasekara from California Department of Food and Ag. Dan Kamen from UC Berkeley. Dawn Cox from Wolf's Next Center for Ag and Environment. Christian Davies from Shell's team. Dr. Jacqueline Gehrig-Faisal from Trees Consulting, LLC. Grayson Bagley from Columbia University. John Sandeman from Woods Hole Research Center. Justin Allen from Salk Institute of Biological Studies, Karen Hogan-Kozura from Veresco Solutions. We've got Keith Paustian from Colorado State University, Ken Newcomb from Sequest Capital, Matt Ramlo from World Resource Institute, Max Duberson, who's now with Indigo Ag, formerly with the Climate Action Reserve. We've got Mitchell Pora, Continuum Ag, LLC, Nicholas Goza from the Alliance of Crop, Soil and Environmental Science Societies, Patrick Spickel from SES Incorporated, got Robert Parkhurst from Sierra View Consulting, Stephen Wood from the Nature Conservancy, Tom Cannon from Goodson Ranch, Tom Stoddard, my apologies, from Native Energy, and William Schleiser from the Delta Institute. So as you can see, we've got a very well stacked work group there from a broad, diverse group of stakeholders who have a lot of expertise in this area. So very grateful to have each of you. And thank you also to a lot of the other observers on the call who put your hand up to be in the work group. Definitely a tough choices for us that had to be made in order to create a work group that was of a manageable size. But I think now I'll move on to an introduction of the general process that we're going to follow here. So in terms of how we develop a protocol, obviously our goal here is to create a robust soil enrichment protocol. We're aiming to incorporate best practices for GHG accounting. Obviously, in particular, we're focused at soil organic carbon stocks, but we will also need to focus on changes in other greenhouse gases. In particular, any foreseeable increases in such gases, we need to make sure they're appropriately accounted for. And at the end, we'll be generating climate reserve tons. Those are the offsets we generate in our voluntary program, CRTs. We will look to adhere to high quality offset criteria and the reserve's own principles, which enshrine those best practice standards. We'll also look wherever possible to leverage lessons learned from emerging technologies, other offset protocols and projects, other regulatory programs, other conservation programs. And in particular for this workgroup process, we're hoping to solicit and incorporate expert stakeholder feedback from all of you. But that second dot point there, let me throw down the gauntlet. The general mantra for all of us is to look to reduce transaction costs wherever we can throughout the entire protocol, wherever we think it's safe to do so. Let's look to streamline and simplify things so that we can try and create the best possible environment for feasible projects. Here's an overview of the general protocol concepts. So that introduction slide had a few of these. Here's a little bit more detail, and there's going to be slides on each of these. A good number of slides. Anybody who's flicked through, got quite a large slide deck here. So first of all, we're going to be touching on eligibility. There's issues here which center on how we define a project itself. What exactly are we talking about? What are the boundaries of the projects? We're also going to look at ownership, permanence and aggregation. So a lot of you will know immediately that's going to be an area where there's going to be some significant opportunities and challenges that we'll have to work through. Additionality. Anybody who's familiar with offsets will know that's another area of critical importance. So the reserve typically has two elements within our additionality screening, but some of those elements are also present in the definition of the project. So we'll go through each of those during today's webinar. We'll also look at the start date and crediting period. So when do projects actually start getting credits, and how long, and what are some considerations there. We'll also touch on regulatory compliance. So anybody that be familiar with offset programs knows that that's an area of critical interest to project developers and investors in particular, for instance. We'll also look at defining the GHG boundary. So that's a place where we step back a little bit and summarize all the different greenhouse gases that we're talking about, where the most obvious sources, sinks, and reservoirs for those would be. Make sure we have that summary appropriate. From there, we'll look to do a deep dive on the quantification. So critical part of the protocol, obviously. Some elements of particular importance will be how we set the baseline. So how do we look backwards in time, and what sort of level of data do we need to incorporate there? Does that need to be updated, for instance, over time? We'll also look at quantifying project emissions. In particular, we're going to focus on the possible use of biogeochemical models, use of emission factors, direct measurement. We're also going to look at sampling, which is typically a critical means by which to set uncertainty levels and to reduce transaction costs as well. We'll also look at CO2 emissions. Now, I'll say at the outset, we've highlighted CO2 emissions here, not because those are of critical importance to this project area, but rather to signal that if we look back up the list there to biogeochemical models, most likely those are going to be well placed to handle a good number of GHGs, but typically CO2 will be something that we would look to quantify outside of those models. It would typically be things like electricity or fossil fuel usage. So we will take a separate look at CO2 related emissions to see if there's ways we can streamline and simplify how we may wish to account for those. We'll also look at leakage. That's typically a very complex area that's folks not familiar with offsets. Sometimes it's a little bit harder to grasp. It's a little bit policy focused. So we'll take a good look at leakage and talk through some key issues there. And then we will focus on monitoring, reporting, and verification. In terms of the development timeline, we showed folks a similar slide to this on the public scoping webinar, but in essence, it's a fairly aggressive timeline. Anybody that's worked on protocols before knows that this is relatively aggressive, and also because we're dealing with some fairly challenging subject matter, it's going to be a particularly acute challenge. So we're all aware of that, and that's why in particular we're hoping to draw on the expertise of the good folks out there like yourselves to make sure that we're fully informed as we move towards our goal here. So we had our scoping meeting, as mentioned, January 15th. We'll be posting the slides soon. The recording's already posted. Now we're into our work group process. So we formed the work group. Thanks again to all of you for joining. Today we're having our first work group meeting. We'll look to have a second work group meeting, probably in late February. So we've already started to tentatively feel out those dates with work group members. And then we will look to have a third work group meeting, hopefully around early April. So right at the end of March, early April. We're thinking it might be useful to have that coincide with our North American Carbon World conference that we have each year in San Francisco. So we flagged a date of Thursday, April the 2nd as a potentially useful date there. So we'll be engaging with work group members in particular in relation to those dates to see if we can start to pencil in some details as soon as possible. From there, we will move to a 30-day public comment period where we present the public with a full protocol. We say, here it is, we keep it open for 30 days, and we let any member of the public provide written feedback to the reserve. We then collate all the written feedback and we reply publicly in writing to all such feedback. And typically we will look to make some final refinements to the protocol at that late stage based on useful feedback received from the public. And then from there, the final step is to move to board adoption. So we will present a final protocol to our board. The earliest date that will be possible will be June 10th, 2020. So that's the date which we're aiming for here. And then once it's adopted, we will celebrate. Here's a similar timeline built out for you. I won't go through this in detail, but I had a little bit more detail there. Gives you a sense of exactly where these steps fit in. and also where we'll be sort of soliciting feedback, etc. Okay, in terms of workgroup members, what are we looking for here? So essentially, we're looking to engage with you as actively as we can, whatever you see fit in terms of the level of feedback you'd like to provide us. The more robust it is, the better, the better informed we will be able to develop a useful protocol. In terms of reserve staff, we're going to be managing the development process. Obviously, we already mentioned we're looking at probably 2 to 3 meetings. Personally, I think 3 would be great if we can do it. We'll look to identify and solicit feedback on specific criteria. So we've outlined in this presentation, for instance, usually in red, a number of key questions we'd like your feedback on, but certainly feel free to provide feedback on all of it. As much feedback as you like would be very welcome. We will look to produce a draft protocol for review. In other words, we'll share a draft protocol with the workgroup in particular at some point, and then critically, we'll be revising our work based on feedback from the workgroup. That's how it typically happens. So from the workgroup, attend all workgroup meetings. That would be fantastic. Very, very grateful to have you. To be active participants, so provide input, ask questions, push us if there's something you're not comfortable with or you don't quite understand. Let us know and let's tease it out. In particular on some of those areas that we're flagging for you, but certainly throughout the document. We'd be very happy to get your feedback. After meetings, we're sharing additional input and expertise as needed, and then review draft protocol. Once we share it with you, you can go through and look through the entire document, page to page, and provide written feedback, then that's going to be extremely useful for us. Expectations. One thing we'd like to flag for the workgroup is that we're considering splitting the workgroup into specific subject matter groups. So let us know what you think about that. Maybe we'll put it to you this way. If going through this, there's particular areas, obviously you're all expert in different parts of the whole. If there's particular areas you're most interested in, let us know. We have a feedback form which we've shared with you, and at the end we're going to sort of come back to this notion. But it might be most effective if we split up into groups and you can self-nominate yourself and say, okay, I'm really interested in this area. That's fascinating. Here's what I think, and you can sort of excuse yourself from the broader context, if you like. That might be a way to help target your limited resources most efficiently. Reserve staff will identify and solicit specific questions. So we might even reach out to you once we have, even when we have such groups with more finite specific questions for those groups as this process evolves. I think the rest we've already gone through. So yeah, I think it goes without saying, we'll try to be as constructive, collaborative and productive as possible here. So certainly leave the door open for all, broad range of views. Overview of the proposed approach. All right, so now we're going to get into the weeds. Okay, so key steps for generating agricultural carbon offsets. This is a slide that was taken from Indigo Ag's vision of how this could work really well in particular. So what Indigo is going to do is they're going to go out and enroll growers in their own carbon offset program. They're going to gather enough data to be sufficient to generate baseline. Then from there, farmers will be supported to actually transition towards new regenerative practices they aren't already doing. More data will be collected, ideally as automated as possible to streamline transaction and reduce transaction costs. From there, greenhouse gas abatement and soil carbon sequestration via the use of models will be undertaken. From there, that information comes to the Climate Action Reserve. Emission reductions are verified and offsets are issued. And then from there, Indigo will look to sell those offsets and then return some of that value directly to the growers themselves. So this is the high-level overview of the model that we see in terms of how each of these elements fit together. So the proposed program has differentiators that will enable impact at scale. So we're going to look to use advanced technology as much and as often as we can, in particular with respect to sampling and modeling. And also we're going to look to aggregate strata. So we're going to get into that in quite some detail later on if that's not familiar with folks. Universal accounting approach, so the methodology should be able to cover all greenhouse gases, certainly all that have a substantial impact on, all for which we expect a substantial flux in greenhouse gases will be captured here using this methodology. We're going to look to simplify additionality as much as we can. I would say that's across the board for the whole protocol, but in particular additionality, we will look to simplify that by using a practice change approach, which we'll get into in a moment. Scalable globally. We hope that this protocol will eventually be applicable anywhere that farmers are interested. And remote monitoring is going to be a key way to be able to facilitate that cost effectively. And we'll get into that in detail, in particular in the MRB slides. Okay, protocol considerations. Oops, hang on. Apologies. Eligibility. Okay, so in terms of eligibility, well, we'll start off with a simple project definition. So on the left here, we've got a couple of conditions which are most likely going to be condition precedents or requisites for a project to be able to go forward. First of all, the protocol is going to include a wide range of activities. So there's going to be specific types of activities that are going to be eligible. We'll go through those in some good detail in a moment, but in essence, they're going to be a lot of what some folks are coining regenerative agricultural practices. Land will either be cropland or grassland at the start of the project, and the project activity does not decrease carbon stocks in woody perennials. Those last two quite simply would sort of indicate, you know, if you're cutting down virgin rainforest to plant some crops, that's not really the type of thing we're looking to encourage here. We're looking to encourage increased soil carbon sequestration on existing croplands or grasslands and rangelands. Major practices, we're going to get into a list, a much more detailed list in a moment, but at the outset on a high level, we're looking at things such as no-till or reduced till, crop rotations, cover crops, reduced inputs, integration of livestock, and also other practices we might explore biochar and woody biomass. So just quickly with respect to woody biomass, you know, it might be that the models we choose ideally are going to have the ability to capture to estimate the sequestration in woody biomass. So we might be talking about things like wind breaks or riparian buffers and the like. So we're signaling here, this is not necessarily a core focus, but where we can also incorporate things like that on the periphery, that would be fantastic. We know there's going to be some soil carbon benefits and other significant benefits associated, so that'd be great. And then we've also included biochar here. The reserve has been looking at for a while at whether it might be possible to include biochar in an offset protocol, and we haven't done that to date. And then myself personally, I can say that given a strong nexus with fuels reduction and wildfire work that's of critical and growing importance throughout California and the nation as a whole, for that reason, I'm in particular interested in exploring if we can include biochar in there. There will probably be a number of preconditions or something like that. For instance, perhaps we would need to have homogeneity in feedstocks, and we would probably also need to consider associated life cycle emissions. In other words, greenhouse gases incorporated in the production process. So we're not going to touch on biochar or woody biomass anymore, but I thought that we would include it just to flag it for folks that if we're able to include such things without a significant detour, then that would be fantastic. But otherwise, the major practices are the ones that are listed there that we expect to be the core focus of this protocol. I might pause just for one moment so I can check messages. Yeah, there's a bunch of questions and some things in the chat function. So if you could continue to put questions to us using the question function instead of the chat, that's probably going to be most useful, because that way I won't necessarily pause to look at those. If we could keep the chat function to reserve staff only, that'd be great. That way, if I break something, they will be able to reach me immediately. And then I think reserve staff are kind of addressing questions, but certainly we'll stop at the end and come back and get a good look through all of those. Excuse me. I'll keep moving because it's quite possible that some of these questions will get answered during the course, but certainly if that's not the case, if it's a burning question, feel free to verbally jump out. Otherwise, you can trust that we will definitely get to all the questions in due course. In terms of eligibility, a little bit of a repeat from the previous slide, but just want to highlight again, in terms of location, they're essentially eligible locations are going to be driven by the availability of data. We're not picking winners by throwing a data at the map. Essentially, we're going to need sufficient data to be able to first validate a model and then also have sufficient data to be able to use the model with sufficient accuracy in terms of the results generated. So ultimately, eligibility is going to be driven by the availability of data, and there are probably going to be a subset of the total areas of the country, practices, and crops. It's likely going to be a subset of the combination of those three that ends up being available due to the lack of sufficient data to include absolutely everything. We'll visit that a couple of times during this presentation, but I'll just leave it at that for now. In terms of additionality, we also have a couple of tests, including a legal requirement test. Essentially, project activities must not be mandated. It's probably not going to be likely, but let's just say there was a part of the country where no-till was absolutely legally mandated. In that case, we would have to exclude crediting associated with no-till for that specific area, by way of a crude example. Regulatory compliance, we will touch on this later on as well, I believe, in more detail, but essentially we would need project activities to not violate applicable regulations. And regulatory compliance is typically something we need to balance, very detailed guidance to project developers and verifiers. We tend to try to balance that with leaving flexibility for reserve staff to be able to adapt to novel scenarios that we didn't envisage. So it's usually a bit of a balance between those two. The choice of model for quantification, that's also going to drive eligibility, and I mentioned that already with respect to location. And then performance standard test, that's another component of our additionality screening. We'll touch on that in a little bit more detail in the following slides. Let me just take a quick pause to take a look. Yeah, some great questions there. We'll come back to those in a moment, but definitely. Oh, hang on a minute. There doesn't appear to be a question box in the webinar today. Oh, my apologies. Well, I can see a question box on my side, and it is definitely being used. So if you're not able to see a question box, then ignore my requests to not use the chat function. Go ahead and use it, that should be fine. But it might be that it's just the user interface on your computer that doesn't have a question box, because we are getting a lot of people using the question function. So yeah, apologies if that's the case. And yeah, do feel free to use the chat function. I'll just pause more often to when those chats come up to make sure I'm not missing signals from colleagues. So yeah, apologies for that. Okay, give me 1 second. Project definition. All right, we've already gone over this. Hang on, I've just got a chat come through. Let me pause. Okay, yeah. Okay, so some folks definitely don't have a question function. So noted, duly noted. Feel free to use the chat function if you'd like to, not chat, but if you'd like to ask questions, feel free to use the chat function. How does that sound? That way we'll keep it relatively efficient. Just give me a sec while I go backwards. Okay, so let's see. Project definition, mentioned this already. We're talking about probably a combination of these highlighted things that are highlighted in bold here. There's going to be a range of activities. These are the things that farmers are actually going to do. It's going to be including things such as cover crops, tillage practices, incorporating livestock, more efficient use of fertilizer, different irrigation practices. It's going to be a combination of those, a combination of locations, and a combination of crops that ends up defining specific projects. and also eligibility will be defined on that basis. In terms of location, we are going to focus on the US to start with. These protocols require significant amounts of data, so it behooves us to focus finitely to make sure we have enough to get this up and running efficiently, effectively, and then from there, ideally, we'll be able to incorporate the rest of the planet Earth and possibly beyond eventually in the protocol. So we will try to build this in a way that's flexible to allow for expansion in terms of both the mechanisms used, the data, updating data, and also location. But just to be clear, at the outset, in order to be efficient and to meet our aggressive timeline, we're going to focus primarily on the United States to start with. So the goal will be at least to get this working up and running for the US and eventually the rest of the world. Okay, so when we're looking at activities, practices, locations, crops, we're going to look for directional certainty in terms of positive greenhouse gas impacts. What I mean there is if there are any of those combinations of activities, practices, and crops for which we expect there to be an increase in greenhouse gas emissions, in other words, it's going in the wrong direction, we're going to need to pay particular attention to those. We may need to either pull them from eligibility, make them not eligible, or we might need some special means to address. Let me give you one brief example and then we'll keep moving. So we know, for instance, that in certain parts of the country for certain systems, if you move from conventional tillage to no-till, there may actually be an increase in certain greenhouse gases, at least for a few years. So that's an example of a scenario where we're on notice that there could be an increase, so we need to account for that appropriately. I won't get into detail as to how, but that's what we mean by directional certainty in terms of positive GHG impacts. We're going to be talking about tests for additionality in subsequent slides, and obviously we already touched on the capabilities of quantification approaches in particular models. Let me pause for 1 second. So let's see. Okay. So nobody on the work group has the question box. Our mysterious GoToWebinar has stripped it. So all your work group members who can't see it, you're not crazy, it's not you. Apologies for that. So feel free to use the chat function and we'll make sure we capture your feedback there. So keep sending us the feedback, and apologies for that lack of functionality. Sometimes they make changes that catch us off guard. All right, let's keep moving. So in terms of project definition, so my way here, there we go. One question we'll put to you, and I'm going to just gloss over this, is can or should we try to prescribe what is eligible in the form of a positive list or specifically eligible practices, activities, locations, and crops? I'm going to not go to this in detail. I'm going to come back to this when we look at our additionality slides. So this is an instance where I'm going to gloss over this slightly, and when we touch on additionality, we'll come back to this question. Let me pause for a quick time check. Looks like we're progressing pretty well, so that's good. So we've got at least a few of you still with us, so thank you. So here is a broader list of possible eligible activities. This list came from Indigo Agriculture, and I think it represents probably a good example of the types of activities that they think are going to be encouraged in their broader program. So we'll essentially look to assess the greenhouse gas impacts of a broad range of these types of activities, and we've already flagged for you a few that we suspect will have the most obvious impacts on soil carbon levels in particular, but certainly we can expect farmers to be looking at uptake of this broader spectrum of activities. One thing I might flag for you is I think this list originally mentioned enteric emissions on the bottom left where it says incorporate livestock, and I stripped it. In hindsight, I could have left it, and the reason I stripped it is I want to sort of flag that, you know, in terms of increases in enteric emissions, if folks are introducing livestock where they didn't have it before, or possibly other activities that increase enteric emissions, we will certainly look to capture those, and likely they will be included in biogeochemical models. So that's fine. We're not going to be ignoring any sources of greenhouse gases that we should account for, that we think will be significant. But the reason I removed it is I didn't want to give the impression that we are going to be heavily focused on trying to capture the any decreases in enteric emissions. That's probably going to be outside of the scope of this activity. If we're able to do so, great, but it might be something more like biochar, where it's a peripheral thing of interest to a lot of stakeholders that might be a little bit outside of the scope for us to expect to be able to include it at this point in the process, at least. Looks like no more questions at this point. Okay, good. Eligibility, model requirements. So we're talking about models a lot here. We are pitching the use of models, and in terms of the use of models, a couple of ground rules, I guess. The first dot point, models should be publicly available. Let me perhaps frame it in a slightly different way for you. What we're making clear here is that we are not looking to create a protocol for which they are the only way to generate emission reductions is through the use of some sort of proprietary tool. So let me assure everybody, we're trying to create a protocol here so anybody who's interested will have the opportunity to come forward. They'll have the opportunity to get their hands on a model. They won't have to pay for it necessarily, and they'll be able to use it to generate emission reductions. So that's what we mean by publicly available. But I should say, eventually, it will probably be most useful if we can have this protocol be flexible enough so that if a party wanted to create such a proprietary tool, that we would also be able to incorporate that, subject to very rigorous checks of their tool, obviously. But at the outset, we will try to create a protocol that does not use any such proprietary tools. So it's open to everybody. And then at a later point, we can hopefully be flexible enough to be able to also accommodate proprietary tools. Any tool that we do use to be the key driver for quantifying emission reductions will have to be rigorously peer-reviewed and validated and rely on pre-existing IPCC, a lot of key data input into the models. So, if you're creating your own models using cardboard and crayons, that's probably not going to suffice. We're talking about quite sophisticated biogeochemical models here. And in later slides, we're going to go through some examples of very specific models that are in consideration. And a good number of folks on the work group, as well as observers, are expert in the use of such models. And on the right-hand side there, just a simple observation that we would need to have the same model used for both the baseline and project scenarios. Once we get into the quantification discussions, you will understand what we mean there, but basically you can't sort of chop and choose between models at different during the same quantification exercise. That would be create errors. Let me pause for a moment to just take a look at our chat function, make sure everybody's happy. Yep, looks like we've got some work group questions. Just going to make sure we don't have anything from reserve staff to make sure there's no technical problems. Okay. Okay. So we will definitely come back to your questions, but if everybody's happy to sort of let the flow go on, maybe we'll just keep moving. Okay. Ownership, aggregation, and permanence. This is an area that's going to be of acute interest to a lot of folks. You'll start to see why if you're not already very interested in this specific subject matter. So in terms of ownership, when we talk about ownership in the context of our offset program, what we're really talking about is the person with the right to implement the project, the person to whom we issue the offset credits, right? So we have this program, we have projects registered with us, they follow the rules in the protocols, and if everything goes well, we give them a big bag full of offsets. We need to know exactly who we give that big bag of offsets to, and we determine that via ownership stipulations in the protocols and in the programs. So in the protocol, we'll have to define very explicitly who the owner is, or well, I should say very explicitly, we will define clearly who the owner is. What we're saying here is it would be great if we can presume the person with the right to farm the land has the right to implement the project. If possible, we would like to avoid requiring proof of title to the land itself or specific explicit written permission of the landholder, although proof of landholder permission and participation could lower risk. The reason we mention this is that we know in previous offset protocol development efforts, specifically around agriculture and cropping, anecdotally, we have evidence that requiring people to delineate exactly who the owner of each parcel is can be one of, if not the most significant hurdle to actually developing projects. It can be significantly challenging to find such information. So at the outset, we're hoping we can avoid that by making some simple assumptions. And then in the following slides, we'll talk through various mechanisms we can use to lower risk. Certainly, if a farmer is able to show us who the owner is, if they're the owner, or if they have a written agreement with the owner, great, even better. But to require that information mandatorily could be prohibitive, so we would like to be able to avoid it. That's the opening challenge that we're positing here. Typically, we accept simple agreements between various parties where possible, including the landholder. So let's just assume we are able to adopt this assumption. We presume the farmer has the right to the offsets, and we stop there. If there's a third party involved, such as Indigo Agriculture as the project developer, what would probably suffice would be a simple agreement between Farmer A and Indigo Ag that says, I am Farmer A, I give my rights to the emission reductions, to the offsets, to Indigo Ag. So typically we make an assumption and then we step back a little bit and we ask for a simple agreement. If you're saying you're not the farmer and you're entitled to the offsets, show us some sort of simple agreement to demonstrate that's correct coming from the farmer, because in this instance, we assume the farmer has the right. We're typically fairly hands-off in terms of exactly what we need to see in that regard. The last dot point there, we can get into this in more detail later, but it might be that things like insurance may end up being a useful mechanism to reduce risk of various things here in terms of multiple parties and whether they're going to be around for the duration of the project, etc. I'm going to pause here to quickly check the chat function, and then I'll be right back with you in a moment. Some excellent questions here, so that's good. I'm going to just make sure there's no technical errors, and then I'm going to keep moving, but certainly we'll come back and jump on a bunch of these questions at the end of the meeting. We're making relatively rapid progress, so we should have quite a bit of time to get back to questions. But again, if any of you have the burning desire to get it out there without waiting, feel free to unmute yourself. But otherwise, if you're all okay with it, I'll keep us moving. So quick time check. I know that there are a range of stakeholders that have told us that they are going to need to change rooms around about this time. Maybe it'll be a good moment to pause just for a couple of minutes to give them a chance to do that. Let's see. I'm just going to pause for a couple of minutes to allow our colleagues to change rooms. A couple of our stakeholders on the web group. So just bear with me. If you'd like to go away and grab a glass of water or something, don't stray too far. Probably get back up and moving within the next few minutes. Okay, we're not on pause yet, don't worry, but I'm getting invited to respond to some questions. So maybe I'll jump in and address one or two, because I've been asked if we could do that at this moment. But don't worry that if I don't get your question, we're not picking winners here. We'll definitely get to yours in a moment. Let's see. Give me 1 second. Okay, let's jump in with a couple of questions with respect to ownership, because it'll hopefully be relatively simple compared to some of the other questions we will get. Let's see. The legal right to carbon credits is critical to buyers, and their ability to then use the credits going forward. Yep, definitely. Which can be at an aggregated level. That's right. So yeah, just to clarify, we're certainly interested in aggregation, absolutely. And so we will try to create as simple a process as possible to allow farmers to come into the program, to hand over the role of aggregation to a central entity, and then to be able to generate offsets with respect to the hard work that they're doing on the farm there. So aggregation, very, very simple process with respect to ownership. That's what we're aiming for, and that's hopefully what we can come to a consensus on. Another question, is there an analog to ownership for other protocols? Yeah, good question. So perhaps the livestock protocol that's widely used in our voluntary program, and also the California Compliance Offset Program might be a good example, where it's not explicit, but there's a simple assumption that the person operating the farm and or the equipment itself is probably reasonably assumed to be the person who gets the emission reductions, right? So if it's a lagoon with some covers on it, then we're going to assume it's the dairy owner that should get the emission reductions. So anybody else that comes along and says, hey, I actually want these, we would expect some sort of a simple contract between the dairy owner and the whoever this third party is. That's a simple example of where we might use a general assumption and sort of not scratch beneath the surface too much unless we need to. Keep it as simple as possible. Could the reserve develop a standard form contract that would delineate ownership rights? Great question. So we do definitely have things like that, which we'll get into in the permanence section in a moment, just in a couple of minutes. In terms of implementation agreements. So it gets a little bit more complicated, but yes, we do use those types of agreements. So yes, the general starting point would be, hopefully we don't need to worry about legal title, just sort of getting you comfortable with that. But yes, we do tend to use templates and standard form agreements with respect to some of those more complex requirements. So it won't be necessarily specifically to do with ownership. It'll be more ensuring that certain practices aren't done. For instance, reverting back to conventional tillage, that quite foreseeably could disturb soil carbon. So agreements are likely to want to be structured in a way to include mention of things like that. So just for those friends of ours who were moving room, not to alarm you, what we were doing here is we were jumping in and addressing a couple of questions while you were making your change, just to make use of our time efficiently. But in a moment, I will get going with the presentation proper. Hopefully you've had a chance to move over efficiently. You've got your popcorn and you're ready to go. Let's see, one more question. Will credit delivery liability sit with aggregators? Will credit liability, oh, hang on. There's more questions coming in, it's throwing me off. Yeah, look, questions as to liability, that's going to be addressed in the permanence section in a couple of, well, all of these slides are related. Very good question, no simple answer at this point. But essentially, yes, would be the ideal scenario. We have to just make sure we're comfortable with that. But for those of you who didn't quite catch that, we'll go through those concepts in a lot of detail. All right, I think now might be a good time for us to get back into the presentation. Hopefully those folks who needed to change a room at the hour were able to do so. Not, apologies, but we'll get going. Okay, aggregation, what are we talking about? So aggregation, basically, we're talking about how we can most efficiently bring as many farmers together to generate offsets as we possibly can. So it's an approach to combining multiple actors, activities, locations into ideally a single project, quote unquote, for the purposes of generating offsets, including specifically monitoring, reporting, and verification. Yep, well, yeah. We paused and now we're back. So hopefully the room change is going smoothly. Let's see, proposed approach. So this is an informal, sort of a loose way to characterize it, but we've characterized it as unlimited aggregation. So what we mean by that is, what we're aiming for is an approach whereby you can get as many farmers as you like from wherever they want to come from, doing whatever combination of eligible practices they like, and we can cram them into a single project. Let's contrast that with an alternative approach we've seen in the offsets world. Let's say a rice protocol, a rice project. A number of those have been much more restrictive, whereby you could potentially only use a single field, and that's your project. A single field doing a single combination of practices, on one single farm. That's one end of the spectrum. And here, let's say this is at the other end, where we're basically going to try to throw it open to the market. Let's leave it up to the market. If the market thinks it's cost effective to cram 1,000 fields or 10,000 farmers into one project, great. We'll try to build the functionality to support that. If at any time the market said, no, you know what, actually it's more efficient to go back towards much more further towards the single field model, great, they would be allowed to do so. We're not going to lock any of that functionality in. We're going to make it up to the market to decide how cost effectively they can develop such projects. And we'll address specific implications of that throughout. For instance, site visit requirements, verification requirements. We'll try to address and minimize how those impact, in particular, this unlimited model. Give me 1 second, I'm just going to check the chat function. Yeah, some good discussion, so that's good. Excellent. No technical errors, so I'm going to keep moving. Key program features, scale, efficiency, accuracy. We try to do this, bringing projects together in order to generate efficiencies of scale, essentially. I'm not going to go through that in more detail, but these things will pop up multiple times throughout the subsequent slides. Maybe the last one. So aggregation may allow for more samples and more data to be used in the project modeling, improving the accuracy of results. So we do see some research which suggests that, it might be a requisite to have, let's say, just by way of simple example, not actual numbers. You might need 100 samples for a few thousand acres, and then if you expanded that to hundreds of thousands of acres, you might only need, another few hundred more samples just based on the efficiency of the sampling process. But we'll get into that in a lot more detail. So the standard mantra is that aggregation could allow for efficiencies of scale. I don't think we're in a position to say authoritatively that it would, but certainly general wisdom would suggest creating that functionality would allow for the market to realize potential efficiencies. Okay, let's focus in on a specific type of approach we think could be useful here. So we're talking about an aggregation approach, which is over on the right there. We're talking about something that would allow multiple participants and project activities to come together in a single project. New proponents coming as they see fit in joining. They wouldn't have to start a new project. They could see what their neighbors are doing. Once they get comfortable with it, they could decide to join in. Quantification would be done for the whole group. Obviously, we've got hundreds and hundreds of useful slides on quantification, so we'll get into specifics in a minute. And then credit issuance. Credits will be issued as a batch to the group as a whole, and only one monitoring report and one verification would be needed for the project as a whole. Obviously, we'll get into a lot more detail with respect to MRV as well, but this is the model we hope to to put together something that's as flexible as possible, that facilitates giant big projects of farmers working together with a single entity to bring cost-effective projects to market. Just going to pause for a moment to check the chat function. Looks like no technical errors, just more excellent feedback, so that's very good. Thanks for that. I will keep moving and we'll address those in a minute. A bit more on aggregation. So why? Some of the pros associated with this idea that we're pitching: maximum achievement of cost efficiency, enhanced ability to manage risk, greatest flexibility for the market. In terms of cons, get into the specifics in a moment, I think we've got some slides on some specifics. But we know, for instance, that the California Air Resource Board has been not fully embracive of certain aggregation models that have come out in, for instance, in forestry projects, and we'll have an opportunity to sort of delve into some specifics there. But we know what's worked well, and we know specific scenarios that regulators have not been happy with, so we can hopefully start to explore ways to make such regulators more comfortable. Because eventually what we're creating here is a protocol for the voluntary offset market. But ideally, these protocols will then be adopted by compliance programs around North America and more broadly. And for that reason, wherever possible, we build these protocols to be as rigorous as possible. You know, some commentators may think that the voluntary market, these protocols are less rigorous. I can assure you that's absolutely not the case. We definitely build these to be as rigorous or more than any compliance protocol. And wherever possible, if we're aware of certain concerns or thoughts of regulators with respect to specific attributes, we will look to address those as efficiently as possible to allow for future transition between voluntary and compliance markets. Just going to pause for another moment to check the chat function. Yeah, some good feedback there. Okay, well, hopefully this sort of format is working for everybody. We're definitely making good progress here, so we're certainly going to have a lot of time to come back and get through all those questions. Hopefully that's what we did in the public scoping webinar, although I did rush it at the end, but we managed to get to every single question. So this, from my perspective, seems to be working well. So hopefully you're all contented out there. Aggregation. I'm not going to go through this in detail. It's a fairly simple concept. We're looking to build this as flexible as possible. There's a lot more detail there in terms of different approaches and whatnot. But I don't know that we need to get into this level of detail, but we will talk about specific challenges with such approach throughout the following slides. For instance, with respect to verification, there's obviously going to be some challenges. So we will have more detail, but this slide here is not necessarily that level of detail. Traditional approach, I'm going to move through this fairly quickly. So here's an interesting example of an approach that we use in the reserves voluntary forest protocols. So I might just pause for a moment. I'm not expert in this area, so I'm not going to delve into any detail, but from what I understand, when the Air Resource Board, California's, the operator of California's compliance offset program, when they looked at this notion of a unlimited flexible approach to aggregation in forestry, ultimately it wasn't adopted for a number of reasons. One, because the target sampling error is fixed, and so this idea of being able to change that area based on the number of projects participating in the aggregate was not something that was openly acceptable. And there were also limitations with respect to geography, just by way of the nature of the forest protocol needing to focus in on specific geographical zones and the types of trees we see built there. That was a practical limitation that prevented a sort of a model that might otherwise allow for parts of forests from all over the planet to come together in a single project. So there were some practical constraints there. I will invite you all to read through this material yourselves, and if you have any insights, you can bring them forward. But this is by way of example of some approaches that we've seen in different parts of our program and also the compliance program. But I won't plan to go through these in specific detail. Again, this is how we approached aggregation in our voluntary forest protocol. I would invite you to read this in your own time, but I won't be going through this slide in particular detail here during this meeting. Actually, maybe the last dot point there could be useful. One thing that's obviously going to be critical is site visits. So what we typically do in our protocols is we try to give explicit guidance with respect to verification requirements, and in particular site visits. So let's look at this last dot point here. Verification bodies randomly select projects for a desk audit equal to square root of the total number of projects, or 1/12 of the total projects, whichever is higher. Next dot point up, when a site visit is required, the verifiers randomly select 50% of projects, whereas as an individual, the percentage of the projects in the aggregate would have been required to hold a site visit that year. So let's not focus on the specific numbers or the mechanism, but this is an example of what we may end up trying to put in the protocol itself. So we might end up with something that says, with respect to site visits, here's some minimum requirements. It's going to be X% of all your fields. It's going to be risk-based driven process. That's the level of detail we will probably look to put into our protocols, and that will have a direct, significant impact on how efficient aggregation is. We haven't sort of developed that thinking yet. This is just by way of an example of what was useful in the forest protocol, and I think we might have a similar example for what we did at our nitrogen management, which is perhaps a little bit more analogous, given that it's a cropping-related protocol. I'm going to pause for a moment just to check the chat function. Yep, some good feedback here. Okay, no technical difficulties, just some good, robust feedback, so that's fantastic. Okay, I'm going to keep moving. You'll have these materials, you can view them at any stage, provide feedback. So maybe just quickly to contrast that idea of a unlimited, what I've loosely termed, or what we've loosely termed an unlimited aggregation, is an alternative model we used on our first use on our grassland protocol. So in that protocol, we said, okay, look, let's, if you wanted to develop these finite projects and come together as an aggregate, let's create a mechanism by which we can streamline the monitoring, reporting, and verification, but you nonetheless retain those individual projects. And so we created this structure called a cooperative, where multiple projects are able to come together and potentially realize efficiencies associated with jointly handling some of that administrative work, the monitoring, reporting, and verification. We also did that in our nitrogen management protocol. So in our nitrogen management protocol, we actually did both. We said, you can have this quote unquote unlimited style aggregation, bring together as many farms as you like, have at it, let's let the market determine what's efficient. Or if you like, you can also bring multiple projects together as a cooperative. In other words, let's create the greatest possible flexibility and let the market decide what's going to be most efficient. We haven't done this in terms of actually rolling out projects. So let's create flexibility and let the market see what works best. Let's just check the chat function, make sure there's no technical errors. Nope. Okay. A lot of good feedback. Right, I'm going to keep going, but as always, if you feel like you'd like to get a question out now, don't be shy. Otherwise, I'm going to return to your questions at the end, and I can assure you we seem to be going very well with respect to timing, so we should have a good chunk of time to come back, especially if you don't mind me sort of glossing over some of these slides where there's multiple sort of instances of the same type of guidance at different degrees of specificity. Okay, I'm not going to get into this again, but this is a bit more of an example of, or a description of how we did it in nitrogen management, but I think the general concepts are probably pretty clear, and the key is in the details, which we don't have yet at this stage. You can help us craft those details. Okay, limited single project approach, compliance, forest protocol. I'm going to get into this in detail. This is not what we're proposing here. Now, let's take a look at permanence. So for those of you who are not familiar with these concepts, permanence essentially means that each ton of CO2 that's sequestered must remain secured for 100 years. So anytime we issue a credit for either soil carbon sequestration or carbon sequestered in trees, we need to make sure that that carbon stays sequestered in that form for 100 years in order for that offset to be valid. There's an example. Credit issued in year 10 would have to be maintained until year 110. That's quite a lot of time, So reversals, what we mean by a reversal is a release of that stored carbon that has already been credited. And then we break those down into what we call avoidable reversals or unavoidable reversals. Different offset programs tend to do this a little bit differently, but generally there's a little bit of a consensus in terms of, essentially, if there's something that the project proponents or project developers did deliberately or they could have avoided, we'll call those avoidable reversals. Typically, it's the project developer themselves that would have to pay those back. We've put in some examples here that might be useful for a cropping context. So let's say no-till is one of the activities you're rolling out, and we're able to use models to quantify the GHG impacts of that, including this fantastic soil carbon build-up in the soils. Let's say the farmer changed their mind, decides to go back to tilling because of whatever sort of practical reasons they think it's useful to do that. That might be a good example of a avoidable reversal. It's a choice made by the farmer. Nobody's forcing them to do it. So we would ask the project developer to then pay back the reversal of stored carbon, and there'll be mechanisms to account for exactly how much we think should be has been reversed and should be accounted for. Let's contrast that with unavoidable reversals, what we consider unavoidable, and that might be something like a natural disaster. With respect to soil carbon, it might be a little bit hard to sort of understand what those might be, but maybe I'll just use the forestry concept because it's a lot easier. In forestry, we're talking about carbon sequestered in trees. If there's a wildfire that burns down all the trees, clearly that's not the forest owner's fault. So we would consider that unavoidable, and we would look to repay the reversal by something we call a buffer pool, which we'll get to in a moment. Let me just pause for a second, just to check, make sure everybody's no technical difficulties. Yeah, a lot of good, robust feedback. That's great. Excellent. Good. Okay. Keep moving. To work. Yep. Ensuring permanence. All right. Various approaches are used throughout the carbon markets to address this notion that we need this carbon to be stuck wherever we've put it for 100 years. Ongoing monitoring is typically quite useful. Buffer pool contributions. So what we mean by the buffer pool is like a central insurance pool, essentially. Each time credits are issued, every single time somebody gets issued credits, a certain percentage is held back. Excuse me. And it's put into a central pool, which we call a buffer pool. And that pool is used to replace unavoidable reversals. So basically, everybody chips in so that the program as a whole has a little bit of reserve there for, things like natural disasters where it's nobody's fault. We like to use that reserve to pay back those reversals to try to keep those projects and the program as a whole afloat. We also extensively use legal agreements. So there was a question earlier about ownership and legal agreements, whether we use standard forms at all, whether that would be something we consider. So we have used legal agreements extensively in the past, agreement to the terms of replacing the credits in case of reversal in particular, or an agreement to maintain a certain level of sequestered CO2, often with restrictions registered on title to land. So that is a reference to a couple of mechanisms we use in our grassland protocol and also forestry protocols. We use written agreements, which are or are not, depending on the circumstances, actually registered on title to the land. A great example of something like that might be a conservation easement, but we also use conservation easements that refer to these external documents, which are then a lot more detailed. And an example here is a document we call a project implementation agreement. So that might have very detailed information, let's say in a cropping context, that might include, restrictions on tillage, things that point to stocking levels, if it's a grazing operation, things like that may be things that would be included in an implementation agreement, and they would be referenced in an easement, which would be registered on title. That's an example of a means by which we have used legal agreements. In the subsequent slides, we'll make it clear that that's not necessarily what we're aiming for here. We're hoping to be able to simplify things, but we are certainly can tell you that legal agreements are widely used as a very effective means to reduce permanence risk. Ton-year accounting. Ton-year accounting is another approach which the Reserve has started to use in sequestration context. And essentially what it means is, instead of giving you a credit and saying you have to keep it there for 100 years, we might give you fewer credits and you would have to keep it there for shorter commitment of time. In other words, a 20-year commitment will get you 1/5 of the credits that you would get if you were signing up for a 100-year commitment. So that's obviously a potentially very useful mechanism to reduce the amount of time that any given farmer needs to sign up for a program, or anybody needs to sign up for a restriction on how land is managed. But obviously, there is a significant trade-off between that amount of time by which these things are fixed versus the amount of credits that one is given. And we have robust stakeholder feedback already to say to us, coming from both ends. From one side saying, farmers are absolutely not going to be interested in signing away their land for 100 years. That's a non-starter. Don't even raise that issue. Not a good idea. And we've also got people coming from the opposite end saying farmers are not going to be interested to be getting pennies on the dollar for already low credit issuances. We need to get the full amount of credits up front. So you can see there are very useful arguments being put immediately from both ends. So we will probably look to try to use a combination of these elements to land somewhere in the middle. We don't want to make the only option here a 100-year commitment, and we want to avoid, as much as possible, having to water down this mechanism so far that it's just not worth farmers engaging. So that's the challenge for us here, and we're going to explore these concepts in further detail. Yeah, I personally threw out the idea of insurance. It's not necessarily so widely used. Let me put it to you this way: it's not necessarily used at the programmatic level, so we don't see programs using it. But I'm suggesting, well, why should let's explore it nonetheless. We know that insurance is used in the industry with respect to the liability for reversals. In the context of either project developers buying insurance or the end buyers of the credits themselves perhaps buying insurance. Sometimes it's actually an insurance product. Sometimes it's an implicit guarantee built into the offset that the buyer gives as part of their sale of this commodity to end users. So I flag that as something that we can perhaps take a look at. And with respect to insurance, what we know is the more detail we're able to give our friends in the insurance companies with respect to exactly what these risks are that we think might result in a reversal. Here we're talking about a reversal. First of all, we have to frame the problem, frame how we think, what are the risks that might give rise to this issue. The more finite detail we have for that, the easier it will be for a company to be able to create a product that might help us mitigate such risk. And we know that it's going to be based on extensive actuarial analysis, so that could be quite a useful way to manage risk. But we'll see. Hasn't been used extensively, so caveat. This is not an example of something that's widely used, but we thought it'd be worth you considering. The proposed approach, all right, let's draw the curtains. What we're looking for is a combination of buffer pool contributions, some sort of a legal agreement with the aggregator. Remember, we're trying to avoid tying the farmers up, and some sort of ongoing monitoring. So ideally, it's not going to be a contract that's attached to the land title of the farmer that forever prohibits how them and their future generations are able to manage the land. Hopefully it's not that. Hopefully it's a legal agreement with the aggregator, with the use of buffer pools and with extensive ongoing monitoring. And maybe some of these other things could also be useful. That's what we're pitching at this point. And obviously, everybody can't have their wishes come true here. There are competing interests that we need to try to find a balance. Let me pause for a moment, just check the chat box, make sure there's no technical problems, just robust feedback. Good. Good. Excellent. Okay. No technical difficulties. All right, I'll keep moving. Permanence, buffer pool, some questions at the bottom here. What are the areas of risk? What are the nature and likelihood of risk for these projects? What are we actually talking about? We're talking about soil carbon for the most part. What's actually going to be causing a reversal? I think years ago we saw some research in Australia when I was working on savanna burning protocols for their system that, you know, what wildfires might cause a bit of a reversal depending on the severity of the heat. But essentially we need to identify with as much detail as possible, if there are risks, what is the risk, what is the nature, what's the likelihood, and let's try to quantify that as much as possible and use that to best inform how we set these restrictions and requirements. Let's just not pluck things out of thin air and just create problems that aren't there. We need to be as well informed as possible as we can in terms of the risks. So definitely an area we'd love feedback on. What size buffer pool contributions would be appropriate? Obviously, we have some good starting points with respect to our existing protocols. So that's probably where we'll look. That third dot point there, discount geographically dispersed projects. We know, for instance, certain stakeholders in the Australian program posited that as an open question when they were looking at the periodic review of their program. What happens if we have geographically grouped projects? Does that cause an extra risk for us as the program operators? If there is a natural disaster and we've got every single project clustered together, does that mean that we're basically the system will collapse? Do we need to build in some additional, maybe it's the other way around, maybe it's a discount for geographically diverse projects as opposed to extra buffer pool contributions if your project is concentrated? Haven't seen any answers to those questions, but certainly appears to be a useful question for us to mull over. What about reducing buffer pool contributions over time? We've had certain stakeholders say to us that, okay, look, in a forestry project, the trees are growing and there's more and more carbon. And incidentally, the trees are becoming more valuable over time. Hence, the risk of those trees being cutting down is actually growing. So we need to really keep an eye on this notion of permanence. But what about in this cropping context? It could be reasonable to assume the opposite is true, that the more used to these new practices a farmer becomes, particularly with holistic approaches, as many as they can stack on, potentially that will lower the risk over time. They're able to adapt their systems, so now they're operating efficiently, hopefully even more efficiently than before, in their core business, which is to farm, to create these agricultural commodities. Perhaps that risk will drop over time. We've also been introduced to the notion that over time it might be that carbon actually moves deeper in the soils, it becomes more stable. So there's two notions there. In terms of human behavior, is the risk dropping over time? In terms of the actual biogeochemical reactions, is the carbon itself becoming more stable over time? These are questions we'd like to posit to you as the pool of experts, and we'll certainly be doing a bunch of research to try to address some of these. I'll pause here to take a quick look at the chat function, make sure there's no tech difficulties. Excellent. Wow, some great feedback. That's exactly what we're looking for, so very much appreciated. Let me do a quick time check. How we're looking, 9:30. Yeah, we're doing very well for time, so let's still think that we'll be able to come back towards the end and really have a good discussion. Permanence, ownership, PIAs, covering the entire project area, recorded with the property. Grassland is single owner, gets emission reduction credits for all of them. So that's an interesting concept, that third to last dot point. We're talking about a single owner of emission reductions getting the credit, and then they have to deal with, there's multiple landowners, and that single owner might indemnify the reserve against claims from other owners. So some sort of, we already talked about legal agreements. Ideally, it's just between the reserve and one aggregator, and possibly it will include something like a simple indemnification, right? Where the project developer says, I've got 10,000 farmers, I'm going to indemnify you against each one of them doing something that causes a reversal, something along those lines. That's what we used as by way of one example in the Grasslands protocol. Can we avoid encumbrance on title? We already talked about that. That's what we're hoping for. Definitely hoping for that. Can we have a PIA style agreement with a single aggregator instead of 1,000 agreements with each one of the 1,000 farmers? These are the general starting points. We've pitched to you how we're going to try to build it. We're going to try to streamline this as much as possible, where it's one agreement with one aggregator and the reserve. And if we need some of these extra requirements, we'll try to build them in. But ideally, we will leave the farmers out of it, and we'll leave the title to the land out of it. That's probably going to be the best way to bring farmers on board. But we will move slowly and carefully to make sure we're not extending ourselves into areas of risk that we're not able to cover as a whole. Because obviously, the more risk we take on, if there's a catastrophic failure, catastrophic reversal, we can put the entire program at risk. So there definitely a balance needs to be struck. Let me pause for just a moment. Lots of robust feedback. Nobody's too angry. That's good. A lot of good feedback. Fantastic. And you're able to see each other's feedback. That's even better. Excellent. Okay. No tech difficulties that I'm seeing. Okay. Good. Keep moving. Okay, tenure accounting. So just to be clear, we have stakeholders telling us that this is not going to be a useful approach because farmers will not like it. We have other stakeholders telling us that this is going to be a useful approach because farmers will not like the alternative if we need a 100-year encumbrance. So we might, the mechanism we described does not involve tenure accounting, and it might be a way around a 100-year encumbrance. So this might not be necessary, but we are certainly have a number of stakeholders telling us that, hey, this is probably a very useful tool to just very easily get rid of your 100-year requirement. Just shorten it and give less credits. So we'll give you a little bit of an overview. I think the concept is pretty straightforward, but just to reiterate, this is not necessarily the approach that we're looking at. We're looking at an approach that doesn't necessarily involve tenure accounting, but it may be that we're able to perhaps build this in as an option. And I think at this point, it just behooves us to make sure you're aware that it's there and that we've used it, and that in certain contexts it seems to work. Effective means to reduce a 100-year requirement. For each ton of CO2 removed or reduced from the atmosphere, you're credited with roughly 1% per year secured. Right, pretty straightforward. If you're comfortable with a 10-year, some sort of a 10-year encumbrance, you would get 10% of your ton reduced, sequestered. If you're comfortable with a 100-year requirement, great, you get your whole ton. Pretty straightforward. graded enforcing. I'm not going to get into this. This is an explanation as to why we have this 100-year requirement. Here's some very beautiful graphics in terms of what it looks like to ensure the carbon that's sequestered for a certain amount of time. It's based around the length of commitment. I'm not going to get into detail there, but it's very colourful, as you can see. I'm not quite sure how the graph on the left was developed, but I love it. Let me pause for one moment. Okay, good. Good feedback. Pause while you marvel at this. Looks like Ayers Rock, Australia. All right, I'm going to keep moving, folks. Get it to work. Yes. Okay, so just to recap, ton is really what we're coming out of the gates saying. We hope we're able to credit for 100% up front by using those other mechanisms, by using a simple legal agreement that's not even attached to the land. I can tell you that you know, there's a spectrum here. There's a lot of different options. The approach on the left probably requires the reserve to take on more risks than some of these other approaches. So what we'll do is work closely with our key stakeholders, such as all of you, to see where we can draw that line. You know, in terms of the risk the program takes on vis-a-vis the risk that individual farmers or the aggregator is forced to take on, and the risk to the market as well, in terms of being able to rely on the product that's generated and sold in terms of the offsets. Ton approach, long agreement, 100% of value upfront, regulatory monitoring verifications, credit sent to a buffer pool. I'm not going to get into this in too much more detail. Let me just have a very quick look, but I suspect there's no tech difficulties. Yep, that appears to be the case. Okay. Permanence, evaluating risk. We've already hit this already, but what are the risks? Let's not assume everything's risky. Let's try to articulate, identify as accurately as possible what these are. If there are no risks, great. Are there any significant risks of unavoidable reversals with respect to soil carbon on farms and ranches? Exactly what are they? Should we consider eminent domain mining activities unavoidable? That's a bit more of a policy question, but some further questions here. More important for you, let's skip the second one, go to the third. Is soil carbon sequestered in deeper layers more stable? Is there something there that we can assess? Do we need to dig deeper to assess that, and somehow we're able to manage risk contributions accordingly? Geographically clustered projects, we already hit that. Reversal risk dropping over time, we already hit that. So these are just recapping some of those concepts we already put to you. All right, that's it for the risk. Permanence, ownership, aggregation. So clearly they are all quite closely related. So whatever solution we have has to be consistent throughout, and it will also have significant impacts on verification requirements, monitoring. Yeah, so quite interesting interesting threads that move throughout this entire piece. And I think that's a good chance for us to keep moving. Okay, yeah, making pretty good time here. Start date, crediting period, a little bit less involved in the last topic, but nonetheless some interesting concepts here that we have to think through. So with respect to start date, that first dot point after the start date delineates when first credits issued, and it also sets the crediting period. So basically the start date is when you can first get your credits. That's the start of the project. The crediting period is the entire period over which you're able to get credits, right? So the start date is when you first get your credits, and then typically we would have a finite chunk of time that we call the crediting period over which you can continue to get credits if you do everything right. We'll get into some specific ideas about what they could be, the crediting period could be. So we need to define what is this action that creates the start of the project. We need to balance additionality by not disadvantaging early adopters. So we'll get into this a bit more in the additionality section, but basically what we'll probably do is point to something like, okay, when you first adopted this new, let's call it regenerative ag activity, that could be what you use to signal the start of the project, and you would start to get you'll be eligible to get credits from that date. Typically, what we also need to do is point at some point in time and say, okay, anybody who's started these activities around the same time that we're developing the protocol can point to the protocol and say, okay, that's why I started it, so I want to be eligible for this point back in time. Here we use a simple example. Let's just say we set that at 2019. So anybody that started a regenerative ag activities, new activities from some point in 2019, let's say that those are easily eligible for this protocol, or they're eligible. In other words, if you started your activity back in 2018 or 2017 or 2002, it's probably not going to be so easy to convince us that you should be able to get credits all the way back to 2002. We usually try to draw a nexus in time between when we're developing the protocol and the start date, the earliest possible start date. And different programs kind of do that differently. We'll probably look to set the start date based on the earliest date of the newest eligible activity that's used to demonstrate additionality. We'll get to that in a moment with respect to additionality, but basically what we're hoping to do there is make it as simple as possible. You're doing a bunch of stuff, you start something new, at that point, we start the project and you start to get credited. But there will be some restrictions on exactly what that activity can be in terms of additionality. It won't be any sort of random thing. It'll probably be a specific subset of activities that you can choose, and it might be stuff that's informed by the availability of sufficient data, for instance. But we'll get into that in a moment when we talk about additionality. Let's see, consider giving each project but also each field a start date. Yeah, this is starts to get a little bit convoluted and sort of conceptually challenging to some degree. But usually with projects, it's a lot simpler. It's just, let's use let me use a livestock example. So you build your digester, you put your poop in it, you destroy the gas, and you start to get your credits. And it goes on for a chunk of time, let's say 10 years. Here we're envisaging, well, we would like it to be flexible to allow new farms to come in. So what we'll probably do is set the finite crediting period for the project as a whole. And then we might also set finite periods for each field to allow new farms to come and go as they choose, and to make sure that you couldn't just sort of keep going in and out of projects to extend the life of your crediting for your given farm or your field infinitely. So it'll be a little bit of more of a conceptual challenge, but essentially we'll try to create flexibility so that the finite boundaries are clear. This is when your project starts, but then it gets a little bit hazy in that fields can come and go, and you're able to get as many credits as you possibly can for your field. But there will be limits with respect to the total years for which either the field or the project will be able to get credits. Let me pause there for a sec. Hopefully that didn't put you all in a tailspin. I'm just going to check for tech difficulties. I think we're probably safe to assume there are none, but robust discussions, good. Crediting period, mentioned that already, the total period for which a project is eligible to receive credits. The reserve typically use 10-year crediting periods, renewable once. That's kind of our standard. So I believe other programs are considering similar project types for 30 years. So perhaps it's 3 crediting periods. So I guess the way to frame it is, we know the reserve's already comfortable with 2 10-year chunks. So that's the easiest starting place. If we want to try to create a bit more space, then certainly we can explore that. Perhaps 3 10-year periods, for instance, something like that. Given the slow buildup of soil organic carbon, longer periods are probably going to be more useful, right? I think that makes sense. We can maybe start to make it a bit more like a, well, much longer term project. Regulatory compliance. So regulatory compliance, simply put, projects must demonstrate no laws are broken, either by the project operators or at the project site. We try to focus on laws relating to environmental and social responsibility, focus on formal determinations by the regulator, focus on substantive problems, not sort of late fees or admin failures. And to be clear, when violations of laws occur, the ultimate result might be that credits are withheld. So it does have a significant impact on projects. So just to step back, we're not sort of creating this as a money spinner. We're here very clearly to push environmental and social goals. So we need to be cognizant of those. We're focused obviously heavily on greenhouse gas emissions. That's our primary focus. But if there are significant detriments occurring as a result of these projects, at some point we need to say that's not going to be something that we support. Exactly where we draw that line is often a little bit tricky. And I can tell you again, this is where another example where balance has to be struck. We get a number of stakeholders saying this uncertainty is too much and it's very expensive for us. We need to have great detail in the protocols or program as a whole to tell us exactly what types of laws. As somebody who's worked for registries and programs for a decade or so, I can tell you that it's often useful to have flexibility. We cannot foresee all the problems that are going to arise. So the greater level of detail, we run the risk of prescribing certain mechanisms or requirements that aren't just in different circumstances. So typically it might be most efficient to try to strike a balance. So we will try to include guidance that's sufficient to give people enough of an understanding of where they're likely to run afoul if in fact there are laws being violated. Having said that, down the bottom there is the standard approach that we essentially try to train everybody that's involved in our program to. And that level of detail is not necessarily always as explicit as it could be in the protocols itself. But basically what we say is project developers have to report all regulatory violations to the verification body. That VB stands for verification body, third-party verifiers. The third-party verifiers then must report all of those to the reserve. So just give us all of the information possible, as early as possible. And ultimately the reserve will provide guidance. And we're happy to do that immediately up front, well ahead of when people are asking for credits. Definitely prefer to see that information up front rather than waiting right to the last minute where everybody's in a rush and all of a sudden there's a bunch of complicated issues come up that we weren't aware of before. We look to ask a few questions. Do violations have a sufficient nexus to the project? Is there agency in terms of, is it the same actors? Is it the same farmer that's done this act that's considered a violation that's also directly involved in these quote unquote regenerative ag practices? Is there causality? Are the practices themselves actually causing the violation, whatever it is? Those tend to be questions we ask. Assuming yes, there is such agency and causality, hopefully we can then nonetheless prescribe the repercussions by looking at temporal restrictions. Can we identify a clear start date for when the regulator says this is a problem and a clear end date? If so, great. Sometimes, for instance, it might be a violation that can be conceptualized as a single day event. Great. Well, then we would only need to pass out a single day of emission reductions. It could be that simple if we're lucky. So that's another mechanism we use to limit the impacts of regulatory compliance issues. Yeah, and then the last dot point is just the general mantra that I brought in that, we need as much detail as we can to help the parties understand what's going on, and then as an offset regulator, as an offset body, we will try to retain some flexibility just so we don't lock anybody into a clunky mechanism that's unjust. Let me pause there for a moment. No tech difficulties, just lots of discussion. Okay, good. Yeah, we already went through this already, but that first point maybe I'll touch on a little bit more. has the regulator deemed it to be a violation? So we're not looking to be lawyers or judges or regulators. We're not interested in that. If there is a formal notice of violation coming out of a regulator, we consider that to be a violation. If there isn't, we consider that not to be a violation. Try to keep it simple, right? We do not have the expertise or the resources to go and study all of the laws in Illinois or Kansas or wherever your fields are or projects are. That's not what we're talking about here. But if your local regulator says you violated a law, then that becomes a problem. And then we need to go through those other steps to identify if it's a problem that should result in withholding of credits. That's one point that might be worth mentioning. We're not looking to stand in the shoes of the regulator and do their job, not at all. I think that's fairly straightforward, but I think we'll probably move on. Additionality, ooh, this is a heady one. So before we do that, how are folks feeling? We're almost at 10 o'clock. Does anybody want to take a break now? Folks would like to keep going. Do you want to shoot me a couple of quick thoughts via chat? If I don't see a flurry of let's break. Oh, here we go. We have a taker. Somebody unmuted themselves. And we've got a few people saying, well, at least one saying, let's take a break. All right. One is officially a consensus. 15 to 20 minutes. That's way too much. 10 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes. All right, let's do 15 minutes and then, oh, we already set it on 15. Let's do 15 and then, so we'll reconvene at 10:15 Pacific time for all your international actors, and then we'll be ready to roll and keep moving. But very great level of engagement. Really appreciate it. Fantastic. Back in 15 minutes. Thanks, guys. Hi folks, just coming up on 10:15, so I think we'll plan to get back into it. We're having a bit of a discussion with reserve staff about this unexpected functionality restriction, such that workgroup members are using the chat function, not able to use the question function, which is resulting in that very good level of discussion only being visible to workgroup members and reserve staff, or not even all reserve staff. So what we're considering, I've put an idea to our team, is to take the entire chat log and post that to the question function. I think I've made it clear to workgroup members that I was intending to go back through the chat function and jump into all of your questions towards the end. So hopefully you're on notice that it's not necessarily a private chat room, but perhaps workgroup folks can let us know if there's any objections to us posting the chat log to the question function. That would then allow everybody on the webinar to equally be able to see all of that really good discussion there. And then I'll still plan to go back through the chat log and the question log at the end to address as many of those questions as we can. Maybe if you guys can ponder that for a minute and see what you think. Otherwise, you know, obviously I've made it clear to workgroup members that you all have the option to vocally raise any issues and we can discuss it verbally. So there's pros and cons to any approach. We're seeing a level of discussion that I haven't really seen before as much. Really good, rigorous discussion happening in the chat. So definitely don't want to discourage that, but it's also less transparency for the rest of the observers and also reserve staff, including myself. I don't really have the as much opportunity to jump in, so there is a little bit of a danger that we could miss out on some discussions. But personally, I'm happy to leave it so that you have both the option to speak up verbally, if you like, and then let's perhaps capture the written chat and let's post it as well. So if you want to continue to chat, by all means, I think that's reasonable, but let's post it as well. That way everybody else can follow along and we can get 50 people engaged in this great discussion rather than the 20 that we have already. I think, just to reiterate, it's a good discussion. So thanks a lot to everybody. Okay, we're getting most people. I can't see any objections yet. So yep, we'll do that. I'll ask staff if you're able to in your own time to grab that chat function. I emailed the complete record of the chat up to our break to a number of reserve staff. So if you have time to grab those and post it in the question function, awesome. Otherwise, we can do it during the next break or something like that. But yeah, for observers, we're certainly not deliberately trying to exclude you. It was more a case of the functionality of the software always changing and keeping us on our toes. So apologies for that. But anyway, let's get back into the fun stuff. Hopefully you're all rested up, ready for action. All right, let me go back a slide. Ooh, additionality. This is a big bogey in the room. This is quite heady conceptual issues that anybody in the offsets world, hopefully you never have to deal with, but nonetheless, here we are. So let's get into it. This can be quite challenging, but to strip it down to its most basic element, what we're talking about here is that in order to get offsets, what we want you to do is do something more than what you would have done before starting the project. We want it to be additional actions, go beyond business as usual. So that's the general premise, that's the challenge. How do we frame it? How do we look at what you were doing before and decide where that boundary line is and where we can safely say something is new and it's happening because of the offset project? That's it in its simplest form. The reserve favours what we call a standardised approach to setting additionality. Let me contrast that with the UNFCCC's CDM offset mechanism. It's an international offset mechanism. That program uses a series of tests which every single project must apply. They must look at financial barriers, behaviour barriers, all sorts of tests. So they typically spend, a reasonable amount of time gathering data and doing some analysis and presenting pages and pages and pages of analysis to say, yes, my project's additional. We try to turn that on its head at the reserve, try to streamline and cut down transaction costs for developers. We try to do that analysis now during the protocol development process. Do all of that as much as we can, where possible, come up with a simple line in the sand and say, okay, as long as your project demonstrates this thing, whether it's adoption of an activity or you hit a certain threshold, we're just going to say you're additional. So you don't need to do anything. We'll do the work now, and it makes it easier for the projects. That's the underlying premise. So question for us is, what could we do by way of a standardized approach? We could develop a specific positive list. In other words, a list of specific combination of practices, activities, crops, locations, based on the data, and we do the analysis and we come up with that list. We did that by way of example for our nitrogen management protocol, where we have this Excel tool, and you can go in and say, I'm in this county and I'm doing this practice and I've got this crop, and it helps you identify whether you're eligible or not. And then once you are, you can get moving. So we have some experience in doing it at this level, but obviously with the more moving pieces, it becomes a little bit more of a complicated picture. Alternatively, what we're pitching here is hopefully we can get comfortable with a much simplified approach, whereby the project developer starts one or more new regenerative activities from an eligible list, and then they're deemed additional. Hopefully, we can create that simplified approach, and we'll get into it in more detail in the following slides. And here's the central challenge: can we develop that simplified approach? Hopefully, the answer is yes. So we will come back to this in further slides. Don't worry. But for now, we'll move on to the legal requirement test. So let's come back to that in a moment. So the legal requirement test is a simple question. Are these activities that we're giving credits for, are they mandated by law? If you remember, the simple premise with additionality is you need to go beyond what you would have done anyway. Well, if you're forced to do something by law, well, then you're not going beyond what you should have done anyway, so you're not going to get credits for that. To be blunt, in a cropping context, it's not really that easy to think about a bunch of scenarios where you're going to be forced to do some of these, what we're calling, loosely regenerative ag practices. So most likely there aren't really going to be too many examples of this that we need to worry about. But let's take a look down the bottom.
We're not seeing the slides change. Sorry to interrupt.
The slides are forwarding, yeah.
Oh, the slides aren't forwarding. That's
They're
great.
both on slide 59, additionality.
So, my bad. Give me 1 second. Luckily, we can probably go back in time. I use my spaceship. All right. Let's see. So you saw this, but you didn't see this. Is that right? Can you see it now? Slide 60.
Yeah, we see it now.
Excellent. So the audio works. Great. Thanks, guys. I tried to bamboozle you, but you caught me. So, yeah, we've covered the content here, but I think we'll keep moving. Thanks for stopping me to make sure we took care of that. Legal requirement test. No activities mandated by laws are going to be receiving credits. Doesn't mean you can't do it, just means you won't get credit for it. Even when a project is mandated by law, typically we would say, okay, no more credits for that specific thing from then on. Or it might be that we're able to say you can get credit for going beyond what the law requires. A little bit tough in a cropping context, but down the bottom we've got some examples. Let's see, can be applied once per crediting period or each reporting period. Okay, so that's the general test. How often we apply it is also a question. We could apply it just once, that's it, done. You pass it, you're done. Or we could require you to do it every year. And I'll tell you, in this cropping context, every year is probably more useful. And here's the example why. So applying it once is typically used for things like capital intensive projects.
One good example is the livestock protocol, where let's say you go out and build a $1 million digester on your farm to handle all the manure. Well, that's a significant investment. So even if, and it's not foreseeable, but even if your local regulator was to come out and say, all right, we've had enough of this manure problems, let's just mandate that for everybody. Given that you made that significant investment, you know, with an eye to offsets, we will probably hold you to being able to get credits for the full 10-year crediting period. That's an example of where we think, okay, we want to send a clear signal. This capital intensive investment is something you can rely on for at least 10 years. Here it is. But in a cropping context, probably not going to be the same types of drivers, but we can certainly explore that issue further. Most likely it'll be appropriate for us to say, come back every single year and just tick the box to tell us that there's no quirky laws in your particular neck of the woods that require you to do whatever it is that you're getting credits for. Some examples in a cropping context. I mean, is this relevant at all? Why do we even need to worry about it? Hopefully we don't. But here's some ideas about where these things may crop up, if at all. With respect to nutrients, higher level water quality. Water quality tends to be where we see these things popping up in cropping circles, right? So somewhere like California, where there's a water board, which is very much involved in managing agriculture. In particular, they're interested in nutrients and sediment loads. So with respect to nutrients, that might be relevant in a cropping context, right? So nutrient management plans mandated in certain circumstances. Typically, we only see them when there's concentrated animal feeding operations, right, in California. So if you've got 1 million cows all in once, that's a massive amount of nutrients. You're going to be heavily regulated as to how you deal with those. So if you're in that type of a context, we might need to look closely at any nutrient management plans that are forced on the farm by some sort of regulatory program. And we would want to make sure that you're either not getting credits for anything you're forced to do, or if it happens that there's a quantitative limit in your nutrient management plan, and typically there is not, but just in case there was, we might be able to say, okay, well, don't worry, the farmer's able to demonstrate that not only did they not breach the law, they actually reduced it even further than this water quality regulator is asking them to. We might be able to give credit for going beyond what the law requires, even in those obscure circumstances where we were able to find a law that does put quantitative limits down. But just to recap, that's not going to be the case for the broad number of farms out there, we don't suspect. And then sediment limits. Sediment limits is another possible example, but more common in forestry. I don't know that I've seen it applied in a cropping context, but let's just be aware of it. For instance, if you've got broadacre cropping happening right next to a river, and there's TMDL, total management daily load limits on sediment, theoretically there could be some implications with respect to cover crops or something like that. In other words, cover crops are a fantastic way to reduce the risks of sediment. So I doubt that there's ever going to be any regulatory requirements that sort of apply in a cropping context, but these are the only places that we could think of where it might be relevant. But hopefully none of these will really feature in the day-to-day business of the projects. Riparian buffers might be another example. If we're trying to get riparian buffers into the protocol by way of modeling, well, that might be an example where those tend to be regulated. A lot of regulatory bodies draw the line at the waterway to say, okay, no cows in the water, don't cut those trees down. So let's just keep that in mind and keep a look at those regulatory programs if we identify any. But generally speaking, we don't expect this to feature highly in a cropping context relative to other protocol types. Let me pause for 1 minute, just check that chat function. Ooh, good questions there. One question about NRCS conservation practice payments, we'll come to that, but that's going to spark some good discussion, no doubt. Excellent. And then again, for the observers, sorry to be definitely not kept out of the loop. We're going to post the chat to the question function later, so you'll all be able to see and we'll all follow along. But don't worry, I'm also missing out on the chat contemporaneously, so we'll catch up towards the end. Let's see, dealt with this one. Okay, credit payment stacking. So this is another example of where there may be other programs out there that are complementary to, but will impact our ability to credit in this program. So where a project is able to receive either credits or payments for the exact same activity for which they receive the offsets, that's considered stacking. So generally, the reserve is okay with stacking unless the credit or payment is specifically for greenhouse gas benefits. Let's say you generated renewable energy and you got some sort of renewable energy certificate or credit, and it wasn't specifically tied to greenhouse gas benefits, it's more tied to the volume of energy you created. That might be an example where our program would allow you to generate those types of credits as well as offsets. Just by way of general example, I'm not saying that's an absolute, just by way of an example. If you contrast that to, let's say you had some other sort of payment from an RCS or someone else that specifically said you're getting your every dollar tied to greenhouse gas impacts of no-till. And then if you came to us and said, I want to be paid offsets for greenhouse gas impacts associated with no-till, but I'm already getting this payment, that would be an example of where we would need to look closely, very closely at whatever it is, this complementary program. You just make sure you're not getting essentially the same benefit twice, because if you were, that would in essence water down the value of the offsets in terms of climate impacts. And that's what we need to avoid. General mantra, the reserve is open to stacking. Great, if you can do it, fantastic. We need to look carefully at the GHG benefits. So what we would typically say is we try to identify programs during the development phase, such as now, and if we can find any, we'll sort of say, make sure you look carefully at this and this, and if you're in this program, you know, let us know. And if there are any sort of foreseeable problems, we'll flag it at the outset. The only other point worth making is that it might be that the other program has a barrier in place that would not let you generate offsets. If we're aware of such barriers, we would also try to flag that, just by way of FYI for project developers, saying, you know, you're welcome to come here, but if you do, just keep in mind you may not be able to also get that payment. We're not experts in that other program, just flagging for you based on our research. It would appear that you might be prohibited from doing both, not by us, but by the other program. So where possible, we'll try to collate that information and make it available in the protocol itself.
You're an observer, that's why you can't see the chat. Can you see the other observers?
We can hear folks chatting at the moment. So if you could remember, unless you'd like us to be engaged in your conversation, and you're very much welcome to, if everybody could self-mute, that would be fantastic. But yes, you're right. There are observers that unfortunately can't see the chat function, so we apologize for that. Yeah, the functionality of the tool is such that observers can use a question box, can't see the chat, and then conversely, workgroup members unfortunately don't have a question box and they can see the chat. So apologies for that. It's not something that we can change or that we anticipated. So there's a little bit of a failure there in terms of our use of the technology. So apologies for that. But to recap, what we're going to do is at the end, we're going to go back through the chat function. I'm going to do that. I'm going to read out a bunch of the discussion and answer questions. And I'm also going to go through the question function and do the same. And then what colleagues will do at the reserve is we'll grab a copy of the chat discussion and we'll dump that chat log into the question function. So everybody on the observer list will be able to see that for the record and be able to get a better sense of what happened. So apologies for that lack of functionality. Let me pause for just one moment. Make sure nobody's flagging any tech difficulties. Okay, good. So credit payment stacking. Generally speaking, the reserve's all supportive unless there is overlap with respect specifically to GHG benefits. Otherwise, hopefully hopefully folks are able to get as much support as they can. Going to move on to the GHG assessment boundary. So this is a part of the protocol where we basically create a simple overview of all the types of SSR stands for source, sink, and reservoir. Basically what we're doing is saying, okay, these are all the types of things happening on this farm that we think could contribute to significant changes in greenhouse gas emissions. Therefore, we need to account for it. And what greenhouse gas best practice tells us, accounting best practice, is that wherever any of these changes are a significant increase when moving from historical practices to the project, we need to account for it. If there's a significant increase, we can't stick our head in the sand and pretend it's not there. So that's essentially what we need to do here. And with this simple summary, we're describing a number of those areas of activities where we think there's going to be those changes. So on the left there, some obvious ones. Soil organic carbon, that's the main game here. Soil respiration, manure deposition. Obviously, that's only relevant if you've got a bunch of animals on your farm. And it might only be relevant if you've got more animals coming on your farm, possibly. But that's the level of detail we'll get to later. But generally speaking, manure, nitrogen inputs. Obviously, if you're a cropping operation, nitrogen is the most significant macronutrient that needs to be used. So there's going to be significant amounts of nitrogen being applied. We need to look at any changes in nitrogen. If there's significant changes, increases, we need to be accounting for that. Biomass burning, fossil fuel usage. And then just generally speaking, if any increases are likely to be de minimis or immaterial, very small, let's just throw out a number, let's say 5% or less. If it's like a 0.01% change, greenhouse gas accounting best practice may allow us to ignore it. It might be that we summarize that and say in this table, oh, by the way, biomass burning, we don't anticipate that to be happening more in the project, therefore we got to ignore it. Something along those lines. Alternatively, if there's expected to be a decrease in greenhouse gas emissions, then we will try to capture as many of those because that's where the credits are generated. But it might be that some of those we make optional. For instance, CO2. We might say, you know what, it's too much documentation for us to be bothered with it. But if you happen to capture all that documentation and you're getting a significant decrease in CO2 related emissions and you'd like to get credit, bring us your documentation and we'll take a look at it and hopefully you can get credits. That might be an example of where a pool is optional in terms of reductions of emissions associated with the pool. A couple of simple questions at the bottom there that you can take away with you. Anything else missing? Anything else that shouldn't be in there? Let me pause for just a moment. Check sure we haven't got any technical issues. Quantification. It's going to get quite heady. Short warning. So what are we talking about? We're talking about approaches by which the project measures the carbon benefit over the business as usual scenario. So let me jump forward and then I'll come back. So with our reserve protocols, the way we set up our quantification is we estimate baseline emissions. And what we mean by that is business as usual, what was happening before the project. Estimate what you were doing before. We estimate the project scenario. So what's happening now that you've implemented your project. And then emission reductions are simply the difference between what was happening yesterday minus what's happening today. And typically your emissions today in the project scenario are lower, therefore you would get emission reductions. So your baseline would be, let's say 100 units, and now you've dropped it down to 80. So 80 minus 100, 100 minus 80 will give you 20. 20 would be your emission reductions. So that's the simple way we frame the quantification section. So if we're talking about baseline project scenarios, that's the general mechanism that we use. So let me go backwards now. So let's see, the proposed approach, we're proposing to have a mechanism by which we measure and we model emissions for a wide range of practices. Excuse me. Let's see, key program features, modeling approach with measured true ups. So we'll get into this in a bit of detail, but we're signaling here using biogeochemical models with measurement. So we'll come back to that on following slides. Comprehensive data collection. So growers will be asked to provide detailed current and historical management data. Historical management data obviously will be useful for setting the baseline, what's happening in the past. And then contemporaneous management data will obviously help us set what's happening in the project scenario or going forward. Participation is maximized by allowing for many forms of evidence. Yep, flexibility can be quite useful. Stratification, we're going to talk about that in more detail obviously, but essentially if we can group many of these multiple fields together based on homogeneous characteristics, then what we might be able to do, hopefully, we're proposing, is that we might be able to just quantify emission reductions on a subset of those grouped common farms and then extrapolate those results across the stratified group. So it's a way that we could reduce the requirements for quantification so that they're not necessarily applied to every single of the thousands and thousands of farms that we hope will be enrolled, and it'll be thus much more economical and feasible to roll out the projects while still maintaining the requisite level of certainty and accuracy. Sampling, soil sampling is likely to be implemented for a number of reasons, including specifically in the quantification approach. And then again, we would look to use a sampling regime so that wouldn't be every single field, 1,000 different soil chunks taken out of every single field. We'll try to minimize the number of actual chunks of soil that need to be analyzed by using a sampling approach. And we'll get into options for sampling approaches in subsequent slides. Let me pause for one moment, a couple of moments. All right, basic overview. So there's a lot of detail here, but this is a simple overview of what it might look like. I shouldn't say simple, it's an overview of what it might look like. So over on the left, hopefully we're able to divide all these farms up into groups of homogeneous combinations of those key elements that we talked about a number of times, the activities, the soil profile, the climatic conditions, and group them together into stratum. Then from there, each of those stratum would be sampled under this idea. They'll also be run through the modeling process, and then what we would model probably the baseline levels, and then if you recall in the middle there, that estimated carbon benefit would be the difference between what the model tells us business as usual would get us in terms of GHG results and what the model will tell us in terms of inputting what our current operational activity data is from the current reporting period. I'm not going to spend too much detail on this page, but certainly you'll have it in your slides and you can come back to it. This is hopefully a little bit of an overview of what it would look like. And then in the end, you extrapolate those results throughout your groups of homogeneous projects, add them all up at the project level, and that's how many credits you get. Bottom right-hand corner, there's your green bag full of shiny credits. Let me pause for one moment. Yep, a lot of good discussion that we'll pull out for the rest of the group to see. Direct soil measurements could be used to true up modeled results. So what we're talking about here, there's going to be a lot more detail about this in the subsequent slides, is the use of a biogeochemical model, so this complicated model, to estimate greenhouse gas emissions associated with this combination of activities, soil characteristics, and crops. And then from there, periodically coming in and doing soil samples as a mean to quantify soil organic carbon buildup. So periodic soil samples in between using a model to estimate emission reductions. So a little bit of a hybrid approach between modeling and the use of direct measurements. Couple of quick points. Yeah, that true up notion. We're not putting into question the issuance in the previous years. It's simply every now and then we're mandating a direct measurement approach. So if the direct measurement shows that, hey, you actually got way more than what we were anticipating via the modeling, then you would be able to get issued for those greater credits, but we wouldn't be sort of going back in time and issuing more credits for previous reporting periods. It would be credits contemporaneously issued in the reporting period for which the direct sampling was taken. So we're not sort of creating a mechanism where we're questioning the validity of credits that are already issued. We're not doing that. Instead, we are noting that for given reporting periods, the key mechanism would be direct sampling. And so there may be a true up that occurs during that reporting period. In other words, you might get less emission reductions than you had hoped for based on previous modeling or more. But it would not call into question the previous reporting periods. Just pause for a moment. Yep, some questions that we're going to have to bring out into the open to air. Yeah, I think that's pretty straightforward, and we'll hit on these subjects a number of times in the subsequent slides too. So several approaches are used. This one we flag it as Indigo's preferred approach, and at this point the reserves are looking to implement this if we can make it work. So single point in time measurement at the start. So every single field that comes in takes a soil sample. So farmer goes out with the shovel and they take a sample of soil. There'll be specific guidance with respect to exactly how to do that. That sample will then be sent off to a lab, most likely. There'll be specific methods employed. The lab will analyze the soil, and results will come back from specific metrics. We'll talk about those a little bit later. But that will help set the baseline, and then from there, probably also be useful, necessary to model business as usual going forward. In other words, whatever the suite of practices the farm's already employing, that's going to have an ongoing effect on soil carbon. So we're not going to ignore that. That ongoing effect might be an upwards trajectory, especially if they're already doing a bunch of what folks are calling regenerative practices, and they're just simply adding one more for the project. Well, then we would expect the business as usual trajectory in terms of soil carbon to be going up. Conversely, if it's a farmer that hasn't done any of those practices, their baseline levels will be going downwards potentially, right? They're continuing to slowly strip the soil carbon in the soil over time. Certainly there will be some farms out there for which that case is accurate. So we would propose to do a single point in time measurement at the start to help frame things, help set the baseline, and then we would use the models to project the baseline into the future. And then we also, separately, we told you that we're likely to periodically come back and look at a direct measurement periodically every 5 years or so. Let's say that's the proposal, just to make sure that the modeling stays on track. I think we've covered this page. Let's see, this last dot point might be worth mentioning at this point. So, yeah, I mean, this notion of a single point in time is interesting. Typically what we would do at reserve is grab data over a number of years to help set the baseline. But with respect specifically to soil organic carbon levels, it might be that we just take one single sample and set that. So there might be other parameters which we need in the modeling of baseline, such as activities that are going on, management activities. It might be for those that we look for in several years worth of data. I think that's probably straightforward, but I think we'll have further slides dealing with it as well. Let me pause for a moment, check the, yeah, okay, no tech errors. All right. I'm not necessarily going to go into this detail, but this is just sort of showing what the difference between, say, a farm that's already realizing some gains in terms of soil carbon before the project even came along, or at least neutral on the left, and then on the right, we've got an example where the baseline soil carbon levels are actually trending down. In other words, the farm on the right is maybe an illustration of a farm that's continuing to strip soil carbon from the fields year after year based on their conventional practices, let's say. The farm on the left is perhaps more an example where either soil carbon is steady or it's maybe even slightly growing over time, even before they start the project. Okay. CO2 emissions. So we've already had stakeholders ask us, well, wait, why are you just focusing on CO2? There's obviously much more larger pools going on, like, methane, nitrous oxide. So we hit on this already. We're not saying CO2 is the bee's knees, the most important one. No, what we're saying instead is that hopefully the models will be able to account for most of the GHG fluxes, perhaps not CO2. So perhaps we would look at CO2 separately. What we're saying to you here is, well, why are we talking about CO2? What are we talking about? Talking about fuels, electricity. So the general concept, going back to that GHG summary table that we looked at a moment ago. What we're talking about is we need to be able to account for any significant increases in CO2, right? Greenhouse gas accounting best practices tells us there's a significant increase. We can't pretend it's not there and ignore it just because we don't want to deal with it. We need to deal with it. So foreseeably, there might be changes in use of electricity. So that could be for things like pumps, for instance. There's changes in irrigation. We might anticipate changes in the use of electricity for irrigation pumps. That's foreseeable. If there's a significant change in the way that the farm uses its tractors and whatnot, we're moving to different style of cropping, these different practices we're talking about. If that's foreseeable, if we think it's going to be a significant increase in fuel usage, well, we would need to try to deal with those two scenarios. We're not saying that it's foreseeable. We're just saying if it was, we should deal with it. So part of our task here, let's remember the general mantra. Let's not create problems here that don't exist. Let's simplify this as much as we can, reduce the burden on the farms and the project developers as much as we can. The simpler we can make it, the cheaper and more efficient it will be to develop projects. So some key questions. Do we think there are scenarios related to those adoption of practices that we talked about, the huge suite? Do we think any of those are likely to cause increases in electricity usage and or increases in fuels? That's the first question. Second question, are any such increases likely to be significant? And we'll set quantitative limits for what we mean by significant, but typically, just generally speaking, is it more than, say, 5% of the total emission reductions? Anything less than that, we can, it's more reasonable to start to ignore them. But let's look at, are there scenarios we think there's going to cause fluxes? What's the volume of flux that we see? And let's assume we unfortunately tick both of those boxes. Well, how do we deal with it? Can we create some simple assumptions, just some simple defaults, and just say, yeah, it's X tons per gallon or X tons per electricity? Are there ways that we can really greatly simplify this? If not, then we'll try to capture data on the electricity and fuel usage. Generally speaking, we do not expect there to be meters on every single piece of equipment, right? We're not talking about a factory where everything's got a meter on it and it's spitting out unlimited data. No, the exact opposite. We're on a living, working farm. There's not sub-meters on everything. There's not a meter on the gas, the diesel tank, none of that. So there will be challenges if we need to account for these activities. So let's try to simplify it. Let's try to reduce the burden as much as possible. If we can come up with some simple conservative assumptions, that'd be good. And then ultimately, the way we typically deal with such things is we're relatively hands-off in offset registries. In other words, we might leave it to the verifier. If the project developer can convince their verifier that their suite of activities is not likely to significantly increase their use of fuel or electricity, if the verifier is convinced you know, the verifier will probably ask them for a bunch of information, then give it to them, and then the verifier will say, yep, that's good enough, done. And they'll write that into the verification report. And then unless the registry sees any, you know, warning signals that that might be incorrect, we would hopefully just defer to the verifier's expertise. One quick point maybe worth mentioning is that as we're moving towards the adoption of more and more technologies on farms, such as precision ag, it may be that we're able to utilize such systems for capturing data to take care of things like this. So that would be an example of the general mantra that more technology, automation could help. So let's also think through if there are existing systems that we can tap into to capture such data, assuming that it's going to be relevant and we need to. So just a couple of thoughts there. Let me pause for a moment. Okay. No tech difficulties. Keep moving. Oops. Sorry about that. Other greenhouse gases. So methane, nitrous oxide. These are probably going to get captured in the model, but if for any reason there's scenarios that are difficult to capture, then our experts on the use of specific models will help guide us towards those areas, and we can explore those challenges as needed. And there may be options. We might be able to just, you know, adopt similar simple assumptions with respect to any of those. And then that last one where it says another option. That no-till example that I gave before that we sort of uncovered, we teased out in our nitrogen management protocol. What we did there is we just said, okay, those specific combinations of region, activity, soil type, crop type that we know the model tells us is going to result in a spike, let's just rip them out of the protocol and make those not eligible. And then we don't have to worry about how we possibly get data to quantify it. That's an example of another approach where we might just say, okay, let's just make these 3 or 4 things ineligible, and then it just greatly simplifies the rest. So we'll keep that in mind. If there were to be such fluxes, one option could be to just simply just rip those out as a way to greatly simplify everything else. Okay. Sampling. Sampling is employed where full quantification is not feasible due to time or cost. So we're talking about soil sampling by way of example. Plots are established to take measurements as a subset of the desired pool, and those measurements are expanded based on the plot size and stratum size if applicable. So stratum again is where we divide our whole into chunks or pieces for which the characteristics within that subset is all similar. So say you got a bag of M&Ms, you divide all your red ones up, green ones, blue ones, etc. And then we would just test a subset of each red, green, blue one, just a small number of each. And then whatever the results are, we would assume the same results across all of those different colors within the pool. That's the general premise here. So our protocols will typically dictate the standards for sampling. What we'll try to do is not tell you how to do it necessarily, but we'll give you options, and then we will tell you the minimum basic requirements if you were to choose option A, B, or C. Here's some examples. So some of the standards, so measurement parameters, carbon pools, precision, size of sample, target sampling error, sampling technique, so the equipment, the training of the operator. Can I go out there and do it? Probably not, because I have no idea what I'm doing. Probably want somebody to have some basic competence. Types of equipment, sampling technique. In some of the slides, there'll be examples of, or in some of our protocols, if you're interested, there are very specific examples of how to take a sample. For instance, you would push it horizontally within the hole that you've dug versus a different method of actually grabbing the soil. So it could be that there's guidance down to that level, and it'll either be prescribed or it could be just optional, where we just talk about the pros and cons of different approaches. And then guidelines around the verification of the sample. In some cases, project developers have latitude to decide on many of the inventory parameters. For example, the forest protocol projects decide plot size, fixed versus variable radius, whether it's a monument, plot center, etc. We're going to get into more examples of those in the coming pages. So what we'll do to our soil scientists on the work group and the observer list is just show you what we use in other approaches that we've used to date and sort of try to tease out what might be some options that are relevant here in terms of setting some of these requirements, what would be some minimum requirements, and then hopefully we were able to retain that same level of flexibility so each project can then decide how they meet those minimum requirements based on the characteristics of their given land. So with respect to direct measurement, we'll probably have guidance in there. Let's step back a bit. So direct measurement is typically the best way to measure soil organic carbon changes in terms of accuracy. We extract samples and we lab test it. And for a long time, dry combustion has been considered the most accurate approach, so sort of like the gold standard. Challenges, why aren't we doing this? Time consuming, we need precision in terms of taking, storing and shipping the samples. You wouldn't just send me off out there to do it. I would have to be trained in terms of how to actually do it. Once I've got the soil, then what? We need to keep this under scientific conditions so that the results will be considered valid. And these things need to be shipped off to some expert in a lab to actually test it. All of this takes time and money. And if we're talking about ideally thousands and thousands of farms, clearly it's going to create bottlenecks and inefficiencies if we need each of those thousands of farms to do thousands and thousands of soil samples. That's one end of the spectrum that's probably not going to work. Nobody's suggesting that would be a useful approach. So we minimize the number of samples taken. We extrapolate across homogeneous conditions using stratification. And then as we mentioned previously, we would look to not even make direct measurement mandatory every single year. Our particular approach coming into it at the outset is to have this as a periodical option to true up what the model is telling us. Might pause there for a moment to check the discussion. He's angry. Okay. All right. Some questions there. I don't think we need to go through this, but let's say we will look to answer these during the development process. Actually, stratification sampling ones might be useful to pitch to everybody. Minimum accuracy standards. What are the absolute minimums we must see? We need to mandate sampling frequency. What triggers the need for new samples? Mandating techniques. Are there specific techniques that we should require, or should we try to leave it more open? How do we confirm stratification is done properly? Do verifiers need expertise in cropping soil organic carbon to confirm the stratification is appropriate? Is that a level of detail we need to mandate? So these will be questions that'd be very good to get as much feedback on as we can. Actually, before we go, so the middle dot point here is interesting. Other approaches other than lab testing. So again, if we can foresee emerging technologies as potentially bringing efficiencies to the table, and here we've listed a couple of ideas that are on the fridge that are, hopefully emerging soon. It behooves us to consider if we can try to build this protocol that's flexible enough to be able to accommodate these things in future when they arrive without requiring a protocol update. So without going through the same process we're doing now, can we create flexibility in there to be able to use these things instead of lab testing? The one example there, a portable reflectometer is an interesting one. We know there's a lot of great work being done at the moment with respect to seeing if that type of technology can be used in a carbon offset program, whereby a sample could potentially be taken out in the field using a simple little tool, and it could be analysed right there and then, or you take it back to your farm and you analyze it with small scale technology that doesn't necessarily require a qualified lab to do. So obviously there could be some great simplification and reduce of cost there. And early results indicate levels of accuracy which are actually greater than the lab tests using that gold standard that we talked about earlier. So early results look quite promising. So we know what we're coming in looking at in terms of the proposed approach, but at the same time,
Dammy, I think
Dammy,
we
I
lost
don't know. Yeah, we lost your audio.
Hi, everyone. This is Heather with the reserve. It looks like Sammy dropped off, so I'm sure he'll be logging back in just 1 minute.
hello, is that back?
Yes, we can hear you now. Thanks,
There
Sammy.
we go. Sorry about that. Internet cut out. What a nightmare. So luckily, I was able to switch to my cell phone. Let's hope the cell phone doesn't blow up. Yeah, just if we have any unforeseeable tech errors, I guess if you can all just bear with me and pause, and I'll do my best to get back online. Otherwise, if it takes too long, as horrible as it sounds, we could possibly ask a colleague to jump in and keep moving, but let's hope it doesn't get to that. My apologies for that. Give me 1 second, I'll just pull the slides back up. We'll get moving. Full screen mode. How does that look? Folks can see the screen again? We're on the stratification slide.
Yep, it never went away.
Yep. Okay. Nice. All right. So let's see. Whoops. Stratification. A couple of examples there. Grassland approach. Strata based on a couple of factors: geography, climate, soil texture, previous land use. Each stratum has its own default emission factors. An alternative approach there, I think that's a Vera VCS program. Stratification may be based on vegetation, management practices, topography, soil texture. So as a layperson, for me, one key question for me would be, to what extent do we think that changes in practices need to drive changes in stratification? In other words, if we're talking about a complex mix of all sorts of different evolving farming, cropping activities, clearly that's much more variability than we would see in a grassland approach, where it's grass one day and it's grass the next day. Pretty much not too much change happening. Is that something that's going to require much more dynamic stratification? Same again with respect to contrasting this to forestry. There's not probably going to be foreseeably as much change happening in the forest day to day as there could be on a farm, a cropping context. So does that need to make this more complicated, or are there ways we can keep it simple? Let me just pause and check. There's no tech problems. Seems to be okay. Right. Is everybody still okay? I'm not going to go into this in detail, but this is a lot of detail with respect to how direct measurement is done in our forestry protocol. That is not a germ, it is an example of a sampling approach. Looks like bird flu, doesn't it? All right, direct measurement forestry protocol. Again, I'm not going to go into this in detail, but there's some good level of examples of how we have done things in the forestry context. Obviously, moving into a soil carbon context, things could quite possibly be different in a number of key aspects, and we will look to draw on the expertise of our soil scientists in particular to help us set any minimum requirements with respect to direct measurement and what sort of sampling approaches we can employ to reduce the requisite number of samples that need to be taken and exactly how they're taken, etc. Soil organic matter and bulk density. That's two key factors that we'll be sampling for. Again, there's a good level of detail there. This is all available to you in the slide, so you read through it and feel free to ask questions. Otherwise, I'm not going to get into that level of detail as we go through it. Just do a quick time check. Still on track. Okay. Pause for a moment. Make sure there's no tech difficulties. Okay. Seems to be okay. Keep moving. Okay, here's an example of sampling for soil organic matter and bulk density, permanent sampling stations within strata, number of plots calculated using a CDM methodological tool, desired confidence is plus or minus 15%, 95% confidence interval. So that might be an example of some sort of minimums that we set. We might work closely with the work group in particular and set something like that, and then, you know, create potentially the project developer has freedom to go about setting their own methodology as long as they're able to demonstrate results are within those bounds. 3 or more samples per plot, sample depth and other details described in the protocol. Sufficient time must pass between verifications. So these are the types of minimum requirements that we may look to write into our particular protocol. Even with respect to lab analysis, it might be that we prescribe specific techniques or specific accreditations. Obviously, the greater flexibility, the better, but there might be some basic minimums that we need to prescribe. Direct measurement verification process. So determining whether the project estimates are sound within specified tolerances to verify sample plots. So we could use a t-test or sequential sampling. These are examples of, I believe this is what we do in the forestry protocol, but there are also similar examples from other soil carbon methodologies in existence in different offset programs currently, similar examples. Sequential sampling, much more guidance here. Test applied independently for each carbon pool, biomass or carbon. Keep going. I'm not going to get into detail with respect to the verification process. Okay, let me pause there and then we'll get into detail on this slide because it's a bit more of an overview slide. Okay, modeling 2 approaches to model carbon benefits in the project. So some methodologies, some project developers would like to employ biogeochemical models every time they want to get credits issued. Alternatively, the use of default emission factors could be used as the basis for quantification. So obviously there's pros and cons associated with either approach. Biogeochemical models, here we've named a specific example, the NDC model. We've got a bunch of other examples named on other slides, which we'll get to a little bit later. So pros and cons associated with biogeochemical model use to drive quantification. The pros are that it's capable of analysing complex relationships in living systems. So you're not just looking at one thing, you're looking at how all of these complex living systems relate to each other. If I make 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 changes, what's the cascading effect across the entire system? That's what these models are particularly useful for. That's what they're developed to do. However, they are complex and they can be time consuming to operate. High learning curve. You can't just sit down and pull it out and start using it. One of our work group members uses an analogy whereby they were able to engage an intern, and the intern was able to come in and use the reserve's grassland protocol tool, which is a much simpler tool than a biogeochemical model. And this intern was able to jump in there and create a grassland offset project because the tool was so simple. We don't expect that level of simplicity here with respect to biogeochemical models. Certainly not with respect to DNDC, that's for sure. So that it will require a lot more of a steep learning curve to make sure the operator knows what they're doing. And even with experts, it will require a significant amount of time to be able to operate the model appropriately. And then nonetheless, there could still be conservative discounts that need to be taken, and there will be varying levels of accuracy depending on the availability of data. And it might be that we sort of need to draw the line in the sand with respect to the accuracy of results. For example, we can tell you that certain combinations of activities, practices, crops, parts of the country, soil conditions, etc., might return inaccuracies of 1,000% or more. Clearly, that's not acceptable for an offset protocol to include estimates with 1,000% uncertainty. I think something much lower than that would be more like what we're aiming for. I'm not going to name specific numbers, but definitely lower than 1,000%. So there's an example of where inaccuracies may sort of complicate the use of models. Let's look at default factors. So what are they? Essentially, a lot of work is done periodically to run models and other techniques to develop simple estimates for GHG impacts of certain things. So default factors are developed and they're published periodically. IPCC has some. USDA Blue Book is an extensive example. So pre-existing emission factors could be plugged in for specific scenarios. Let me give you an example. If you apply manure from cattle, it's going to have this result per level of manure that you apply. That could be an example of a simple emission factor that we'd be comfortable using. All right. We don't need you to go out and test the energy in the manure. Let's just assume if it's coming from cattle and if it's in this state, then we'll use the default emission factor for manure from that type of cattle in that state. It might be something like that. There are a limited number of defaults out there off the shelf we can use. These defaults tend to be on the conservative side, and there may also be levels of accuracy associated with it that we're not comfortable with. It may be possible to develop new defaults. So that's something else that we should keep in mind. With the reserves grassland protocol and also our nitrogen management protocol, we employed experts, some of whom are on this work group, to use biogeochemical models, run the models many times, just like is proposed on the left. But to do that during the development phase, to create brand new emission factors, and then those be off-the-shelf emission factors that project developers could use. So the underlying premise is that if you've already got them there, you don't need to go and do the modeling yourself. You just grab them and you use them. So we're not proposing that here. We're proposing the model on the left, using the model year in, year out. But something that we should keep in mind, and a challenge to everybody on the work group is, what do we think are the levels of resourcing needed to do the option on the left versus the option on the right? And at what point is there a commensurate level of resourcing such that maybe it's more efficient to just periodically develop new emission factors? And maybe we need to try to build this protocol in a way that would allow us to update emission factors as we see fit without having to go through a formal protocol update process. That's another mechanism we build into our grasslands protocol, where the emission factors sit in a table outside of the protocol, and therefore we're able to update them as soon as there's data and we're able to run the numbers. So a couple of different models here, options I should say, and pros and cons associated with both. we're proposing at the outset to look to use the option on the left where biogeochemical model would be employed year to year, but perhaps we need to try to keep open the possibility of also allowing for the option on the right to be used where possible. And there are discussions in the literature and different circles about relative conservativeness and accuracy of one approach versus the other. Different proponents will claim the other one's less conservative and accurate. Personally, I don't know that that's a useful distinction. In my mind, the availability of data drives the level of accuracy, and then it's up to us to determine what level of accuracy we want. In other words, whether you run the model year in, year out, or whether you use default emission factors. It's the level of data that's available that determine the accuracy of results, and it won't change whether you're proposing to fix your result until you're updated or whether you're proposing to repeat every single year. I don't think that there's going to be a magic difference necessarily between the two. It will be driven by availability of data. Let me pause for a moment. It's a lot to take in. Have a quick look at the tab. Okay. Biogeochemical soil models work by simulating classical laws governing carbon storage. Nicely articulated slide here. I'm not going to go into the details there, but in essence, this sort of it shows you the beautiful complexity that's included in these models and the sheer amount of work that's been done here. They really are fascinating and quite useful. So definitely a really powerful tool. We're very fortunate to have available. But with that power and comes complexity. So we need to be aware of that. And I think in subsequent slide, we sort of talk softly about options that we might be able to use if we are employing these things. What can we do to try to cut down on the risk of error and just the level of complexity involved in using them? Oh, might be this slide, is it? Let's see. Okay, so what models? What are we talking about? We're talking about, here's some examples. So there's the NDC model. That's in fact being explored explicitly in relation to this protocol development effort, whether that can be an example of a model that we use. Comet Farm, we have members on the work group who are, played a pivotal role in developing it and maintaining it on an ongoing basis. We've worked closely with those bodies. We've used Comet Farm before in order to generate default emission factors. We've also developed a protocol that specifically uses DNDC. In fact, we have a protocol that only allows the use of DNDC. DACENT is another example of a model. So just to recap, what we're thinking will be good here is to allow for the use of models and to set some specific parameters about how said models could be used, but probably not to lock it so that it's any specific model. For instance, we might say, use of models is fine. There's going to be some minimums that we talked about before. And DNDC is an example of a model that we've explicitly approved in relation to this protocol. But if you were to come to us with other models, such as Comet Farm, DACENT, or something new that's not in existence now, we would run those models through the same process we use to look at DNDC, and the reserve would approve the use of that other model. And there would be some minimum standards, some minimum requirements with respect to parameterization. Those are the types of functionality we need to think about as we're building this. Some challenges, just to be explicit, there's very limited examples of where these types of models have been used effectively to date in offset programs. Key challenge. This has not been used widely successfully, so let's not be under any misconceptions that what we're proposing is a simple fix. It's not, so we need to be very conscious of that, and where possible we need to try to remove complexity and streamline and simplify. This is a challenge for all of us. And again, the data is going to be pretty critical. The availability of data to parameterize the model, so that there is a requisite level of data before we can even use the model for any given scenario, any combination of those practices, crops, regions, etc. And then fresh data on a year-by-year basis to update. Both of those are going to be challenging. So data is probably going to be quite critical with respect to where we're actually able to roll this out. Typically, the reserve is very prescriptive with respect to exactly which models and exactly how they must be parameterized, and then provide guidance with respect to MRV for requisite data. So questions, can we instead just focus on minimum accuracy requirements? I just talked about before, can we not do that? Can we instead just say, bring whatever model you like, but here's some minimums. And here's an example of one model we're definitely comfortable with. Is that an approach we can take? Can we move away from the more prescriptive approach? What do we need to see regarding parameterization of the models? Is this tied directly to stratification? Does the parameterization need to change year on year depending on the more complex mix of activities that are happening, or is that going to be fairly stable? How tricky will that aspect be? If we think back to the DNDC only methodology with specific parameterization requirements, that might not be so useful in a context where practices are evolving year by year. That could be overly restricted. Can we defer to third parties to parameterize the model, to run the model? Let me give you a little bit of context. So what we understand is the DNDC model, it's housed in a particular institution, entity essentially manages that model, and in order to use the model for commercial purposes, that entity has to actually be engaged to run the modeling, which creates an interesting scenario for us whereby we need to think through carefully what the implications for verification are. In other words, if it's a trusted third party that's running the model every time, do we even need to expect verifiers to run the model themselves, defer to the third party? Those issues will come up again when we go into the verification section a little bit later, sort of whetting the appetite there. Can we minimize verification requirements? What about automation? In the context of using such models previously in offset protocols, one idea that was brought about when for instance, DNDC was prescribed in terms of RICE protocol in California, there was an idea that we could employ experts to simplify the user interface of these models. So rather than have this hugely complex model where there's 1,000 moving pieces, what about if an expert was able to simplify the user interface so that there's only, let's just say 5 as an example, there's only 5 moving pieces. That could be a way to simplify data inputs by project developers, could be a way to reduce errors potentially. Can we lock the rest of the model so that not only are we just asking for 5 pieces, but we're also preventing them from being able to go in there and break the code and change all the equations for anything else? Those types of concepts were put forward as useful ways to reduce complexity in terms of project developers, but then also reduce the complexity for verifiers. We need to come back in and determine whether these models have been used appropriately. I think we'll touch on those themes again with respect specifically to verification in a minute. But let me pause there for a moment. Just check. Okay. Seems to be tech glitches. Okay. Data sources. So here's a couple of sources where we're likely to pull data from. And obviously, if we're capturing soil sample data, that's going to be quite useful going forward. It might be that, you know, we're able to self-populate our own data sets eventually. It'd be great. But there's also going to be a bunch of other useful operational activity data that we're going to capture. So there's going to be databases such as these, and then there's also going to be a range of technologies that we hopefully employ on farm to actually capture the data. But here's some examples. If you had any other thoughts about other data sets, that'd be great. So specifically, we're talking about soil carbon, obviously, and then we're also talking about data with respect to all of those different practices that we listed as possibly eligible practices. The more data we have on all of those, the better in terms of what's already happening, what's happened historically, what's happening now, all those sorts of things would be quite useful. Emission factors. We went through this already, so I don't think I'll touch on this. Simple question, will it be as cost effective to use biogeochemical models at the discretion of folks, as opposed to mandating that everybody needs to run the model every single year? Is that a trade-off that's just not worth it? Could we have it so that it's optional? People could do both, and we periodically develop emission factors. Just some general considerations to keep in mind there. And yeah, that point down the bottom again, we will try to build this such that any emission factors we do use can be updated over time without needing to update the protocol itself. So that's just a little procedural step that we'll try to do on our end to make sure any future proofing is efficient as possible. Nitrogen management. So here's an interesting SSR, like a source sink of reservoir source that could be potential.
Did we lose other people's audio as well?
Oh, sorry, yeah.
This is setting the reserve. Oh, Sammy, is that you?
Hello? Yep.
Okay, perfect. We lost you for a minute there too.
Oh, sorry. The audio dropped out again. Okay, sorry about that. But it's back now. Is that a thumbs up?
Yep, sounds good.
Okay. Sorry about that, folks. So with respect to nitrogen management, can we copy paste from our existing nitrogen management set of emission factor defaults? Is that a shortcut that we can incorporate into the protocol? And it's also worth perhaps just looking at it as a case study of how we were able to use biogeochemical models to develop default emission factors in this complex cropping context. This was also done very successfully in a grasslands protocol, but arguably it's a lot simpler in that context because just to put it simply, not the data inputs, but the risks associated with change in practices is much less in the grassland context. But we've got two working examples of where default emission factors exist. Oh, looks like we lost somebody. Can somebody confirm that you can still hear me at least?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, nice.
I can hear you. I think Jonathan said he had to go.
Okay. Thanks, Karen. Yeah, so just some questions for folks. Well, can we draw on our existing work? Let's see if there's some sort of approach where we can give people a shortcut if they want to use it, and it's also by way of example of what that could look like. Sensors, so data. There's a bunch of databases. We'll look to use those, but there's also fresh data that can be gathered year in, year out. We know that we're going to need a bunch of data to feed into our models. We're also probably going to need a bunch of activity data that doesn't necessarily go into the models. And we need to think through where emerging technologies can help us streamline those requirements. So let's definitely not create scenarios where we mandate a bunch of activities that are overly resource intensive. Let's try to think through how we can streamline all of our monitoring, reporting, and verification requirements in particular. Try to envisage where data could be coming from in the future. Are there systems? Are there existing technologies, emerging technologies? And how can we ensure that we take best advantage of those to reduce transaction costs for farms and project developers? So let's take a look at some examples. We think these are probably going to be most useful for monitoring, reporting, and verification. What we mean by that is they might not go to the level of feeding into the model specifically for the quantification. They will to some degree for sure, but they definitely going to be useful for monitoring, reporting, and verification. So here's some examples. Things like satellites can gather operational data, such as things like planting, irrigation, fertigation, harvest dates, corroborate other operational activity data, potentially decrease the need for site visits. That'd be great if we could reduce the number of times we need to fly a verifier across the country by use of some of these technologies. Let's explore that as far as possible. Indigo presented during the public scoping webinar a really interesting tool that they're developing, which they're calling the TurboTax of agriculture. It's a great example of a tool which could be employed in the field, and it could be employed to gather and collate and manipulate a lot of data, in the sense that it looked like you could upload photos into it, you could take it around and you know, take time and date stamped information, including all sorts of different operational activity inputs, collates it, and ideally it will present it in a form that you know, a verifier or the offset registry is able to grab it and look at it and neatly, succinctly see as many of those requisite data points as possible in as simple a way as possible. Wherever we can do that, we're going to reduce transaction costs and make this more feasible, more palatable for farmers as well. So that's definitely something we're going to try to explore as much as we can. A couple of general questions there. How do we minimize the work for verifiers to confirm appropriate tool is being used? So a couple of workgroup members, we've been chatting with them about maybe we can draw on existing protocols for validating software. We can say, you know, maybe we can say, okay, if you want to create a tool that's used directly to streamline and reduce MRV, maybe we should think through having you confirm that the tool has passed or been through these standard practices for demonstrating validation of software. That could be a useful way that we are able to grab the tool and say, okay, this tool went through those protocols for software validation and it passed, therefore, and it's locked. Therefore, the verifier can just grab the results and, you know, throw the inputs themselves and spit the output, and the verifier wouldn't need to validate the tool, or the reserve or the offset registry doesn't need to validate the tool. Just trying to think through ways that we can incorporate the use of technology and also at the same time reduce how much work the verifier does when it comes to the use of that same technology. Second one's pretty much the same point, third-party validation and or reserve approval tools. Thirdly, can we automate capture, transfer, integrity of data gathered using such tools? Again, this idea of possibly drawing on software validation protocols could be useful, where maybe it strips out a lot of this risk and we're able to, everybody just sort of stand back and nod when this tool's pulled out and say, great, the tool's efficient and we trust it. That would be useful if we can get to that point. As much as possible. Let me just pause there for a moment. Okay, so there's feedback coming in contemporaneous, which means I hope everything's working. All right, so general mantra, let's streamline, simplify, automate as much of this as we possibly can while we're still confident in terms of the uncertainty levels and the risk that we're taking on. Let's try to make this as easy as possible for people, but still be robust. All right, leakage. Ooh, this is a nasty one. Okay, so this is a conceptual issue that folks outside of the carbon world will hopefully never have to think about. Leakage is essentially referring to basically activity shifting leakage. When greenhouse gas emissions are unintentionally changed or moved from one source to another due to project activities. E.g., let's see if this example is useful. If the crop yield declines due to your project, then we suspect production may increase somewhere else to compensate for the loss. That is the general theory. If I suddenly produce 10% less corn on my farm, then somebody else is going to be trying to fill that gap somewhere else. And so we need to discount the emission reductions to account for somebody else just doing more elsewhere. A bit of a conceptual issue for folks who are not used to carbon markets and how it applies, but that's the general premise. So how do we address it? We could evaluate yield impacts and make adjustments accordingly. So the American Carbon Registry and the reserve nitrogen fertilizer protocols require increases to project fertilizer rates if your yield drops. In other words, if your yield drops significantly, we're going to assume somebody else is just going out there and making up for that gap. So we're going to force you to artificially inflate your nitrogen usage as if that increased, that significant decrease in yield never happened. That's one mechanism that could be used, or it could be a default deduction. So the reserves grassland protocol assumes 20% leakage from grassland project. So, you know, this could be a good example of simplicity versus conservativeness. That second one means you don't have to get out of bed to do a bunch of calculations. You just take the 20% hit, just keep moving. Not interested in all that data, just take it done. Or you might say, you know what, that's way too conservative, way too much of a hit. And it could be that we create an option where you have both. You could do either. You just take 20% if you don't want to bother with it, or you gather the data and you demonstrate that it's less than that. There could be a variety of options here. Or we assume the risk is low and we ignore it. We've had stakeholders say to us, we don't anticipate such a big drop in yield, specifically associated with what we're doing here. So let's just start off from the position of ignoring it, and then hopefully that sticks. And it's probably also worth mentioning that we have stakeholders bringing us information to suggest that the literature available at the moment, which isn't exhaustive, suggests that there could be short-term losses in yield associated with the adoption of some of these practices. However, in the longer term, those reductions taper off, and in fact, yield can increase in the longer term. So these are things we can study. Is there some mechanism that we can build in that says, let's just ignore this because we know that the longer term trajectory kicks in? Or is there some sort of contemporaneous temporary discount that tapers off? Food for thought, certainly not set in stone at this point, but issues that we should explore. And if there are other options that we haven't seen used before or that you can think of, definitely don't be shy. We're not pretending by any means that this is a simple said and done thing. We're very, very much open to alternatives. Let me pause for a moment. Okay, everybody seems to be still on board, so that's good. Okay, keep moving. Getting close to the end, folks, and then we'll have a little bit of time to chat, hopefully. But if not, we will try to post responses to all the discussion. So MRV, let me try to pick up the pace a little bit. Monitoring, reporting, verification. MRV, let's shorten it. Rules dictate how project data is collected, organized, submitted to the registry, and then checked by verifiers. That's the V part, verification. We'll consider questions around types of data, sources, monitoring methods, frequency, templates. Can we streamline things by just creating a simple template? It's amazing the number of stakeholders that say to us, just give us a template. Obviously, flexibility, there's a bit of a balance there, but that might be something we explore. And then as a general mantra, that last dot point, are there systems, complementary programs, existing oversight, automation, technology, third parties that we can rely on? If something's already been done in a robust manner, in particular by third parties that don't stand to immediately gain from telling us everything's okay, well, let's try to piggyback off that. Let me give you one quick example. The low carbon fuel standard in California, it says for, there's a bunch of meters that are being used. It's fuels moving around facilities. If your meter happens to be a financial transaction meter, well, those are regulated by the state. So they've got a sticker on the side of every single meter to say that your local body has checked it. Well, we're not going to worry about quality assurance, quality control, because it's got that sticker. As long as it's got that sticker, done. Stand back, hands off. If we can look to existing programs to simulate, then that would be fantastic. We can cut down on the level of detail we need here in the protocol. So let me throw that as an open challenge to everybody. If there are existing systems, third-party experts, if there are existing programs already being run here, let's try to piggyback as much as we can. Another example that was thrown out by a stakeholder was, and this is far out there, definitely not something that we've explored, but if there are trusted third parties out there, maybe we can try to draw on those resources as opposed to forcing the verifier to fly around the country to do these checks. One example that was thrown out, and this is just an example, not something we've explored, is, for instance, NRCS offices are in every county in the country. Imagine if we could say, if somehow you're able to draw on a third-party trusted person like that to say, yes, I've been there, or yes, this is plausible, yes, what they're saying appears accurate, that could potentially be a way that we cut down on the need to fly a verifier across the country, by way of a simple example. So general mantra, let's explore any existing systems, programs, etc., especially where it involves some sort of trusted third party that's actually looking closely at what's happening. If that's the case, we can possibly water down what we need to do as a general mantra. Okay, monitoring, we're talking about, well, they can vary quite a lot in terms of volume, complexity, frequency of data, therefore the cost associated would vary. Lack of data is the starting point, but that's changing over time, obviously. And then over on the right is just some general statements. Let's reduce complexity and make this simpler. Okay, so let's simplify as much as we can. Monitoring, what data points do we need and how often? The protocol is probably going to specify requirements with respect to some operational stuff that it isn't day-to-day, such as eligibility, those types of things. So we'll need to gather data on that sort of thing. How often? How do we get it? How do we verify it? These types of ideas we need to think through and simplify as much as possible. How do we delineate the fields, the acreage, the entities? What about emissions data like fertilizer use, fossil fuel use, electricity, etc. Planting, harvest, fertilizer. We've talked about these a number of times. Technologies, automation, third parties. How can we simplify these and streamline the requirements here? What methods are available? So we've talked about these as well. There might be direct measurement of some of these things. Remote sensing is increasingly becoming useful. So we'll try to make it so that we're able to defer to project developers to bring such emerging technologies that simplify things. We definitely don't want to prescribe things that prohibit efficiencies in future from coming to the table. Reporting. We will require a comprehensive monitoring report that comes from the project developer to the verifier. That's pretty standard. So we might be able to create a default, like a template maybe. We get asked that quite often. And then on the right there's some general observations, general mantras, general goals. Let's simplify as much as we can. So reporting, yeah, as I mentioned, in our program, what we mean is this is the information coming from the project developer to the verifier, and then from the verifier it comes to the reserve. So in terms of how frequently report, this could be interesting in a cropping context. For larger projects, like say an industrial one, there might be enough credits on the table that they want to do it every year. It's just like, let's go. In a cropping context, it might be that it's cost prohibitive to really verify every single year to get your credits. It might be that the project developer wants greater flexibility to defer verification. That's quite possibly a scenario we'll see. So we'll look through an appropriate sort of balance there. 24 months is something we use in our protocols often, where we throw it open to the project developer. You can come back every year if you like, or you can come back every 2 years. And in the forestry context, it's actually every 6 years. So we'll look to create some flexibility there. Open question, longer periods, what do folks think? If anybody here thinks that we should be even more flexible, let us know. Obviously, it's a balance between people wanting to get paid versus how expensive is it to generate these credits year in, year out. But ideally, we create the flexibility, and then the parties are able to pick and choose as the market dictates is most efficient. Just a quick point there in the middle. Longer periods create greater risk that you did something wrong in between when you're coming to us for credits. So really, there is a implicit mechanism built in there that the risk is on the project developer. They might not discover an error until 2 years later, and worst case scenario, 2 years worth of credits end up in the bin. Last point, just simple. How can we streamline? How can we simplify things? Templates might be one example. Verification requirements and associated costs vary. Site visits, talked about that a little bit. We'll try to prescribe minimums, reduce those as much as possible, because that's usually the largest cost center. Allow for sampling, maybe with some prescribed minimums. We're not going to require Verify to go to every single field, 100 different plots, definitely not that. It's going to be somewhere at the other end of the spectrum, somewhere in the middle. Use of models and tools to simplify things. And then on the right, those same comments, simplify, simplify, simplify as much as we can. Verification considerations. Are there any minimum requirements we should consider for the team itself? Do we need there to be an agronomic expert or a certified soil scientist on the team? We're likely to have very well qualified verifiers, both on the work group and in observers. So, getting a sense from them in particular, but also from everybody else in terms of how much expertise do we want on the team itself? Are there things here that just should be done by somebody who's particularly expert in a specific area? For example, soil science. That might be one where it is useful, or maybe it's not. But let's see what our experts, which is you, all of you, see what you think. What data sources at a minimum should be reviewed by the verification team? There's some examples. We're asking for any other ideas. We also touched on before the use of existing systems, programs, third-party experts. Let's also be open to including other ways to simplify verification considerations. Very open to trying to streamline it where we can. Site visits, the big bogeyman. Site visit indicates plane tickets, very expensive. So how can we cut down safely? Here's some examples of what we've done in the past. Nitrogen management, risk-based selection. At a minimum, it's 5%. If we're talking about thousands and thousands of fields, even that 5% could start to stack up and be cost prohibitive. So let's think through carefully how we can reduce that number safely. I think I'll leave it at that. Can we instead rely on a combination of objective third-party proxies? Or we named the NRCS staff twice now, right? But just to be clear, that's just a hypothetical example. Is one sort of trusted third party that we could look to use. I'm sure there are a range of others. University extension folks, there could be all sorts of options. That's by way of example. Sensors, trusted technologies. Open discussion. So we ended up running much further on than I thought. So I don't know that we're going to have time to go back, but we will definitely post the chat log, and we'll try to go back through the question log. But does anybody want to verbalize any questions, discussion at this point, rather than us pulling through the logs to do so? Doesn't look like it. So let me apologize. I thought we would have plenty of time. I was hoping we would to go back through all the questions, but we've actually got such a good group here that we've got loads and loads of questions, both in the question function and also the chat function. So we'll try to post those so that everybody can see what the discussion was, and then we can go through and try to reply and engage with each of you. I'll need to go back myself, and our team will, to see exactly what sort of level of interaction might be useful. And it might be that we're able to grab you guys using your email address and sort of try to approach it that way, or it might be that we create a central log of responses. I'm not going to commit to anything at this point because I just can't really see the sheer volume there. Do folks want me to try to go through a few questions with the last few minutes? Should we do that at least? We know what you guys think. In the meantime,
Sammy,
Yeah.
it's Robert. I think
Robert.
I think probably it's worthwhile at some point to have a more structured discussion. I mean, you've given us a whole lot to think about. We could go through and we could spend another hour or so, but to me, there's some big buckets And so if you take the feedback you've gotten from us and start thinking about buckets and having, you know, the areas where there's the biggest discussion, I think that'd be worth having us as a group dig into those. I don't know what others think, but that's my 2 cents.
Yep, that sounds like a great suggestion. Let's see if anybody else has thoughts on that. Okay, but just generally speaking, what we've talked about today is that given the lack of functionality here unexpectedly in the technology, we had 2 separate streams of discussions happening. So what we can do is, one is to make sure all stakeholders are able to see the other stream, so everybody's able to see everything. And then secondly, Robert suggested something which sounded quite good, which is that we can go back through these various logs, and we can identify where there are points of discussion, maybe several people asking similar questions, or a bit of a discussion around a theme, and we can try to hone in on those as by way of making sure we provide feedback and absorb that feedback appropriately. I think both of those sound good. Let me move on to the next couple of slides, and then we can come back to this discussion. Make sure we hit those last bits, because there is one point that's particularly relevant, which is splitting the work group. So subcommittees. So we sent the work group members a feedback form, and we're asking you, if you're interested, to self-identify your level, your areas of interest, and your availability to engage in additional small group discussions on one or more of the following topics. We can go back over the logs and see if we can identify folks as well, and invite you. But certainly, if you'd like to self-nominate, Group 1, applicability and eligibility. Group 2, quantification and modelling. Group 3, monitoring and data collection. So yeah, as I said, we can also go back through the logs and see if there's some clear patterns emerging there. But certainly, everybody on the work group at a minimum, if you're interested in self-nominating, let us know by way of the feedback form. Send it in and say, yep, let's do this. And then, as I said, we'll make those discussions available to everybody. And then we will also see what we can about efficiently delving into some of the discussion and having the reserve respond. Next steps, email us to nominate yourself to work on specific protocol considerations we discussed today. This is a tall order, but let's please, if we can, submit comments and feedback by February 14th. So a little bit over a week. If you're able to do that, that would be fantastic. Certainly we can take your feedback at any point, but if you get it to us within a week, it's going to be really useful to help us start to respond and be able to use those insights to start with development of the protocol proper. We're going to be drafting protocol on an ongoing basis. We're going to share a protocol draft with you. I deleted a prospective date there. Let's say as soon as we're able to do it, we'll send it over to you. We are flagging a possible second work group meeting in late February. Ideally, we're able to get the draft to you before then, but that's not certain at this point. And then we would ask the work group to go through the draft word by word, section by section, provide feedback. So the second work group meeting, probably something similar today, unless people have any suggestions, and we'll think through as a team, you know, the technology constraints we faced and see if we can come up with some ways to deal with that. But you can expect a further 2 4-hour session coming up in late Feb, most likely with a bunch of materials being sent your way before that. And then certainly observers and workgroup members can expect us to follow up with respect to just some of the shortcomings with the technology as we experienced today. Just quickly, that's my contact details there. Again, Sammy Osman here. So, you know, I'll be steering a lot of this, and then there'll be a good, strong reserve team behind us. General inquiries, there's another email line there, so feel free to email me and or policy. You can certainly CC both. It's probably the safest. That way you can catch me if I'm around, or the policy team will be able to get back to you. So you have our details. Don't be shy. We'll be following up with you with respect to sharing some of the discussion today across the groups. Hopefully you can get to us your feedback forms, self-nominate if you're on the work group. That'd be fantastic. And then again, we're going to post these slides and also a the presentation itself, a recording of the presentation will be posted online at some point. We've got a couple of minutes left, any or 1 minute. Big thank you to everybody. It was a very well attended meeting, very robust engagement from all folks. So greatly appreciated. This is exactly what we need if we're going to keep ourselves best informed and have the best chance to developing it. So hats off to each of you for your participation. We're definitely very grateful for that. And unless anybody else wants to make any comments, I think we could probably tie it up shortly. Okay, good. So thanks to all of you. We'll be in touch soon. And yeah, let's get into developing this protocol. Thanks, folks. Bye.